It was an empire once, one that rivaled Egypt. It controlled most of modern Turkey and stretched into Syria. One that managed a sophisticated, multi-ethnic state with advanced laws, diplomacy, and even an army built around the largest chariot force of the ancient world. But that empire disappeared so completely that 3,000 years later, people hardly knew it existed. That is the Hittites, and the story of how they were recovered, thousands of clay tablets pulled from Turkish soil written in that language that no one could read and finally cracked by a Czech linguist who'd noticed that the word for bread looks suspiciously similar across languages, is one of the great detective stories in the history of scholarship. What those tablets revealed was really astonishing. A civilization of first rank, hiding in plain sight beneath the dirt of central Anatolia. A story waiting to be told. Well, the Hittites have waited long enough. So here we are, telling their story today. Good to have you with us for another Bronze Age exploration. Finally, we get around to a general history of the Hittites. I'm excited. Now, if you've just come to this channel, welcome, and if you're returning, thanks for coming back. Click the like, comment, and subscribe, you know what to do, and thank you to those keeping this a crowd-funded, ad-free, and sponsor-free venture by supporting in the links of the pinned comment and description. You'll find where you need to go if you want to get there. Now, enough of that, let's begin. The Anatolian Plateau in the early 2nd millennium BCE was a world with deep roots. The indigenous peoples of Anatolia, whom the modern scholars call Hattians, from the name they gave their territory, had been living on the plateau for millennia before the Hittites even arrived, and their civilization is by no means primitive. They had well-developed urban centers, metalworking, religious practices of considerable complexity, and not to mention a body of myth and ritual that the Hittites would eventually absorb so thoroughly that distinguishing Hattian from Hittite elements in later religious texts is quite an intriguing puzzle. Now, the Hattians are not quite the Hittites. The confusion of the names is honestly quite annoying, I know. Well, understanding who the Hattians were still helps us clarify who the Hittites were by contrast. The Hittites, you see, were speakers of an Indo-European language, the earliest attested Indo-European language in the historical record, which is itself one of the reasons that they matter so much to linguists as well as historians. The Indo-European language family includes most of the languages of modern Europe. You've got German, French, English, Russian, Greek, all the others. But it also includes Persian, Hindi, and a few others, and the question of where the Proto-Indo-European speakers lived before they disappeared across that enormous range has been one of the most contested questions for 2 centuries of linguistic study. The Hittite evidence is central to this debate, because the Hittite branch of Indo-European is so archaic that its earliest appearance on the Anatolian Plateau in the late 3rd millennium BCE is one of the data points for reconstructing the original dispersal. It also preserves features of Proto-Indo-European that were already lost in all the other attested branches. The precise mechanism and timing of the Indo-Europeans' arrival in Anatolia remain debated. The current balance of evidence, drawing on both linguistic analysis and ancient DNA studies of Bronze Age skeletal remains, suggests a migration from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, i.e. the grasslands of northern parts of the Black Sea, sometime in the late 3rd or early 2nd millennium BCE. The world that the Indo-European migrants entered in Anatolia was not empty nor passive. The Assyrian merchant colonies, the Karum, the trading posts established by the old Assyrian merchants for northern Mesopotamia, were operating in the region by around 2000 BCE, and their extraordinary detailed commercial records preserved on clay tablets in archives at the site of Ganesh, which is modern Kultepe, near the modern city of Kayseri, give us our first glimpse of pre-Hittite Anatolians in a documentary rather than just pure archaeological terms. These Assyrian merchants were trading textiles and tin for silver and gold, and their records provide an invaluable window into the politics of central Anatolia at a period just before the Hittite historical record begins. The Anatolian rulers and merchants who appear in the Karum texts have names from multiple language backgrounds, some Hattian, some Luwian, which is another Indo-European language, and some belonging to languages not yet fully identified. We're still trying to dig through them. It demonstrates the linguistic and cultural complexity of the plateau on the eve of Hittite historical prominence. The Assyrian Karum at Ganesh, Karum being the Akkadian word for trading post or commercial quarter, literally quay or port, reflecting the original association of such establishments with river trade, a story for another time. Well, this Assyrian port at Ganesh Karum was the largest and most important of the Assyrian merchant colonies in Anatolia. But it was one of more than 20 such establishments scattered across the plateau. The archaeological excavations at Kultepe have revealed a substantial Assyrian merchant quarter with houses, administrative buildings, and temples that formed a semi-autonomous community living alongside but distinct from the Anatolian city above it. The merchants who lived in these colonies were not colonial administrators, nor were they military men, but rather private businessmen, if we're going to use that term in a sense of 4,000 years ago. I suppose it still counts. They operated on their own account too, corresponding with family firms in Ashur through a postal system whose speed and reliability, given the distances involved, Ashur is over 1,000 kilometers from Ganesh, by the way, is one of the most impressive achievements of the early 2nd millennium BCE. The letters they sent back and forth with their families and business partners deal with prices, debts, disputes, romantic entanglements, and the frustrations of long-distance commerce with an immediacy, that can make them feel uncannily modern. Same sort of concerns that we have in modern times. You have shipping times and all the rest. It's like, what do you mean it's going to take 6 months to ship this all the way from Karum, from Ganesh rather, Anyway, among the Anatolian rulers who appear in the Karum texts and the subsequent Hittite historical tradition is a figure named Pithana. This is the king of Kusara, who is described as a conqueror of considerable reach and energy. His son, Anita, took this inheritance further and left behind what may be the oldest royal inscription in an Indo-European language. It has its namesake, the Anita text, a literary account of his conquest that the later Hittites preserved and copied, apparently treating it as a foundational document of their own political tradition. Anita campaigned across central Anatolia, conquering multiple cities and establishing a territorial dominance whose extent is uncertain but clearly quite significant. He also performed an act whose symbolic weight would echo through subsequent Hittite history. He destroyed the city of Hattusa, the city that would eventually become the Hittite capital, cursed its ground so that nothing should ever be built there again, and scattered salt on its ruins. The later Hittites, who chose Hattusa as their capital despite Anita's curse, were apparently willing to accept the, unpopularity of building their capital on a ritually cursed site. Maybe cheaper land values, I don't know. Or it is more likely, in the other side of the theory, that they were making a deliberate statement about the authority. You see, They don't really care about the curse. They're just overriding this predecessor's prohibition. No one's going to tell them what to do or where to build. That is a bit of a statement. In any case, the Anita text puts us at the very edge of the Hittite historical record. The people, the language, and the political traditions are taking shape. But the old kingdom that will crystallize them into an identifiable state is still not quite there. But let's get to that lead up. The founding of what scholars call the Hittite Old Kingdom is associated conveniently with a king named Hattusa I, who ruled approximately 1650 to 1620 by the most widely used chronology, though the precise dates of early Hittite history remain contested, especially among the specialists. Well, the uncertainty of 2 to 30 years in either direction should be kept in mind throughout, so let's give them a little bit of leeway. Hattusa I is the first Hittite ruler for whom we have substantial contemporary documentation in the form of royal texts, and what those texts reveal is a king of formidable military energy and considerable political intelligence, who was simultaneously building an empire and struggling to keep his own court from destroying itself. Hattusili's military campaigns extended Hittite power in two directions. First, they went southward into the northern Levantine coast, and westward into territories that would define the continuing western frontier problem throughout Hittite history. You'll see what I mean once we move on through it. His Anatolian text, which is a bilingual document preserved in both Hittite and Akkadian, clearly intended as a pragmatic statement of royal achievement, describes campaigns against Alalak and other sites in what is now northwestern Syria, with a confidence and specificity that tells us the Hittites understood their campaigns in international terms from very early on in their history. But the campaigns were not simply military adventures. They were also economic operations, oriented toward the control of trade routes and the extraction of tribute from wealthy urban centers of the Levantine coast. Once again, it all comes down to the money, always. But what gives the documents from Hattusili's reign their distinctive character is the degree to which they expose the internal political crisis alongside external military achievements. The Hittite royal succession in the Old Kingdom was persistent in its sources of instability. There was no clearly established rule for how the kingship was to pass, and the result was a succession of coups, murders, counter-murders within the royal family that would have made the Hittite state ungovernable had the institution of the kingship itself not been sufficiently robust to survive these repeated internal convulsions. Hattusa I's own text addressing his succession, sometimes called the Political Testament of Hattusa I, is an extraordinary document. And it's just crazy that all this stuff survives 4,000 years later, but hey, that's why you put stuff on clay. It just survives a lot better once it's baked. Well, basically the document is a king apparently dictating from his deathbed, denouncing the relatives who had betrayed him in terms of controlled fury that have lost none of their rhetorical power over these centuries. He disinherits his nephews, denounces his sisters, and he names his grandson, Mursili, as the heir in a document that reads simultaneously as a legal instrument and a personal vindication. So, in comes Mursili, who inherited Hattusili's throne and his territorial ambitions, and he would take both of them to their logical extremes. His campaigns extended Hittite military reach further than any predecessor, culminating in one of the most remarkable military operations of the ancient world, and that was the sack of Babylon. Now, just quickly, Babylon for quite a long time was that jewel in the crown of the Bronze Age Near and Middle East. It was the big prize, A lot of these rulers would call themselves King of Babylon and all the rest because that was the place to be. So sometime around 1595, the exact date depending on which competing chronological system of the ancient Near East did you personally adopt, but let's just speak in general terms, 1595 BCE, Mursili led the Hittite army down the Euphrates River, deep into Mesopotamia, attacked the city of Babylon, took all the treasure, and brought it back to Hattusa, along with the cult statue of the god Marduk. Babylon was the greatest city in the Near East. The Hittites had reached it from central Anatolia across 1,000 kilometers of difficult terrain. But that achievement was not sustainable, because the Hittites didn't really attempt to hold Babylon, and the campaign appears to have been primarily a raid rather than an attempt at permanent conquest. But in any case, it did demonstrate a military capacity and a strategic ambition that established the Hittites as this power of first rank. Immediate political consequences of the raid were the fall of the old Babylonian dynasty, whose final king, Samsuditana, could not recover from the fight. The old Babylonian period ended not with conquest, but with a collapse, and that was triggered by a Hittite raid. The return from Babylon did not produce the political rewards that Mursili might have expected. I mean, it was good, but it was not great, and it was especially less than great when he was assassinated by his brother-in-law Huntili shortly after he got back. No time to enjoy that shiny Marduk statue, I'm afraid. In a coup that inaugurated what historians sometimes call the Dark Age of the Hittite Old Kingdom, a period of roughly 100 years in which the succession question proved repeatedly deadly, with kings following each other in rapid succession to a combination of displacement, murder, and dynastic exhaustion. The details of this period are pretty obscure, in ways that reflect both the inadequacy of the documentary record for a time of political chaos and the tendency of the eventual stabilizing kings to edit out those uncomfortable details from the official record. Now, what is clear is that the great edifice Hattusili I and Mursili I had built was not destroyed by external enemies during this period. See, the Hittite state, that had survived, but the structure had ceased to expand, and it turned its energies inward toward the destructive work of dynastic competition. The crisis of the succession reached its resolution, partial, imperfect, but still real, with a king named Telepinu, who came to power sometime around 1500, and whose primary achievement was not military conquest, but rather a constitutional reform, which at the time was a bit more important. The Telepinu Edict, as modern scholars call it, is one of the most important documents in the Hittite archive, a royal proclamation that attempted to establish clear rules for the succession to the Hittite throne. It defined the proper procedures for trying members of the royal family accused of crimes, and articulated a theory of the relationship between the king, the royal family, and the body of great men, the Panku, who served as a collective institutional memory and judicial body of the Hittite state. The edict basically begins with a survey of the succession history of the Old Kingdom that is simultaneously a historical and political document. Telepinu reviewing the murders, coups, family disasters of the preceding century, not as neutral history, but as a demonstration of what happens when succession rules are violated. The rhetorical logic is clear. This is chaos. This is what chaos looks like. Here is what it costs the kingdom. And here is the procedure that will prevent it from happening again. Basically, they just want to get things back to normal. They'd had enough of those days of the backstabbing and all the rest. No one likes that. The specific succession rule Telepino established gave priority to the sons of the king's principal wife, then to the sons of secondary wives, then to the king's daughters' husbands, a system that privileged legitimate descendants while providing clear alternatives in the absence of suitable sons. The edict also addressed the treatment of royal family members in political disputes. Now they were to be tried formally, they were allowed to plead, and they could be executed or exiled only on the basis of a proper judgment by the Panku, not simply murdered by whoever had seized power most recently. A lot more of a stable system. Whether the Telepinu edict achieved its intended effect is a bit more of a complicated question. The succession remained a source of instability throughout Hittite history. A piece of paper, or rather, a piece of clay, is not really going to fix that. Later kings were deposed, murdered, or outmaneuvered by political rivals with a frequency that suggests the constitutional reform did not eliminate the underlying problems that had produced the chaos it was designed to address. But the edict did establish something important. It gave us a framework, one of legitimate procedure, a set of standards against which actual behavior could at least be measured and criticized, and a principle that even the most powerful members of the royal family were subject to institutional constraints. Now, this is more than many contemporary political systems have achieved, and it created a tradition of legal thinking within the Hittite administration that would eventually produce one of the most sophisticated legal codes in the ancient Near East, the Hittite Law Code. Now, that's a document of genuine intellectual interest, preserved in 2 versions across multiple tablets, and spanning several hundred laws. Kind of a big deal. Now, unlike the famous Code of Hammurabi, which I'm sure is on the tip of your tongue, which is organized as a monument to royal justice, and whose punishments are often, frankly, quite savage, the Hittite laws show evidence of genuine legal evolution. The earlier version of many laws prescribes death for the offense, and the later versions of the same law substitutes a fine or other penalty. This is not softening for its own sake. It's more of a pragmatic legal philosophy, one that values restitution over punishment, and recognized that a dead criminal could not compensate his victims. The laws address an enormous range of situations, from the agricultural and commercial matters one expects of a Bronze Age legal code, to some of the most detailed regulations of personal status, sexual conduct, and ritual purity to survive from the ancient Near East. They also reveal, incidentally, the social and economic texture of Hittite life in ways that royal annals and diplomatic correspondence cannot do. You've got the prices of animals and grain, the relative status of free persons and slaves, the conditions under which a marriage could be dissolved, and the responsibilities the landlord bore toward those who worked in his fields. The Middle Kingdom period, roughly 1500 to 1400 by conventional chronology, is the least well-documented period of the Hittites, and this is partly because it was a period of consolidation rather than spectacular achievement. They were playing it safe for a little while. You see, the Hittite state, it kind of pulled back from its furthest extension, concentrated on the management of Anatolia itself, and engaged in this relationship with the kingdom of Kizzuwatna in southern Anatolia, whose repeated negotiation and renegotiation through treaty after treaty tells us something important about how the Hittites managed their neighbors. Through formalized agreements, carefully calibrated mutual obligation, and the language of diplomatic kinship that were later characterized their relationships with the great powers of the Near East, the Hittite politicians were getting things done. The Middle Kingdom was the period in which the Hittite state became genuinely literate, at least in an administrative sense, developing the scribal traditions, the archive practices and administrative vocabulary that would make the later empire the best documented state of the Bronze Age Near East. But if the history of the Hittite state has one pivotal figure, a single ruler whose decisions and campaigns transformed the situation so fundamentally that everything before and after must be understood in relation to him, that figure is Suppiluliuma I, who came to the throne around 1350 and proceeded to remake the map of the ancient Near East with a thoroughness that even his enemies were compelled to acknowledge. France has Napoleon, Rome has Caesar, the Mongols have Genghis Khan, and the Hittites have Suppiluliuma. His campaigns in Syria eliminated the Hittite competitors, established the northern Levant as a Hittite sphere of influence that would last for over a century, and created a confrontation with Egypt, whose consequences would define the political world for the remainder of the Bronze Age. The circumstances of his accession are themselves a window into the politics of the Hittite court. It appears that he came to power through a coup of some kind, displacing or succeeding a king named Tudalia II, whose relationship to Suppiluliuma is, well, it's a little bit disputed in the sources, and the energy with which he then pursued external conquest may reflect in part the domestic political logic of a king who needed military success to legitimize a questionable succession. Whether or not that's the right reading, the campaigns he launched almost immediately upon taking power had an urgency and strategic clarity that suggest extensive prior planning, possibly during a period when he was a military commander under his predecessor. The primary target of Suppiluliuma's ambitions was the kingdom of Mitanni, the Hurrian-speaking state that controlled much of northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, and that had been, for the most part of the preceding century, the dominant power in the region between Hatti and Egypt. Mitanni had developed close diplomatic relations with Egypt under the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, exchanging daughters in diplomatic marriages and competing with the Hittites for influence over the smaller states of the Levantine coast. Suppiluliuma's first major campaign against the Mitanni, conducted around 1344, appears to have been less successful than he was hoping. The campaign narratives preserved in what is called the Deeds of Suppiluliuma, compiled after his death by his son Mursili II, are honest enough about the limitations of the first campaign to give us confidence in their reliability when they describe the subsequent triumph. The first campaign probed Mitanni's western territories and installed Hittite-aligned rulers in some of the border regions, but it did not fundamentally alter the balance of power. The Great Syrian Campaign, the operation that truly transformed the Near Eastern political order, came around 1340 and was preceded by years of diplomatic preparation that demonstrated the strategic intelligence that characterized Suppiluliuma's approach throughout his career. He secured his western flank before moving east, settling the problematic relationship with the Arzawa kingdoms of western Anatolia through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic arrangement. He established intelligence networks in Syria and cultivated relationships with regional rulers whose disaffection from Mitanni he could exploit. Well, when the campaign began, it moved with a speed and coordination that took both Mitanni and its smaller allies completely off guard. Suppiluliuma swept through northern Syria, capturing city after city and installing Hittite governors or loyal local kings, and then he looped back through Mitanni's western territories, plundering the Mitanni heartland and carrying off enormous amounts of tribute. In a single campaign season of approximately 1 year, he had transformed the northern Levant from a Mitanni sphere of influence into a decidedly Hittite one, and he had reduced Mitanni from a great power into nothing more than a client state, struggling to survive between Hittite pressure from the west and Assyrian pressure from the east. Basically, it was all over for Mitanni. The aftermath of the Syrian campaign produced one of the most remarkable episodes. Suppiluliuma was besieging the Syrian city of Carchemish when he received a letter from the Egyptian queen. The sources call her Darkamunzu, which is probably a translation of the Egyptian title, like the king's wife or something like that, rather than a personal name. This letter informed him that the Egyptian pharaoh had died, that she had no son, and that she wished to marry one of his sons and make him the king of Egypt. Pretty good deal, huh? Suppiluliuma was apparently so astonished by this proposal that he sent an envoy to Egypt to verify that it was genuine, convinced that it must be some kind of diplomatic trap. I mean, it's too good to be true, right? But here's the thing. It was good, and it was true. It was a genuine offer. The pharaoh had died. This was almost certainly the mysterious pharaoh, now identified by some scholars as Tutankhamun, though the identification is not universally accepted, but we should mention it. The Egyptian court was in a succession crisis, sufficiently desperate that the royal widow was proposing to marry a Hittite prince. Suppiluliuma eventually sent his son Zananza to Egypt to take up the offered throne. But poor old Zananza was murdered along the way, almost certainly by Egyptian officials who opposed the arrangement. The Egyptian response to Suppiluliuma's furious protest was inadequate, and the resulting Hittite-Egyptian hostility would be quite important over the next generation. What might have been the creation of a single Hittite-Egyptian superstate through dynastic marriage instead became the origin of the conflict that would culminate at Kadesh. Suppiluliuma died not in battle, but in a plague, one of the most consequential deaths in the ancient world, and whose origin lies in the campaigns themselves. The Hittites had brought back from their Syrian campaign prisoners of war in enormous numbers, and among those prisoners, or the soldiers who had been in the disease environments of the Levant, came the plague that swept through Anatolia and killed both Suppiluliuma and his immediate successor, his son Arnuanda II. The plague prayers of Mursili II, the documents in which the next king struggled to understand why the gods would be inflicting such a disaster upon them and what ceremonies might fix the problem, are among the most personally moving documents that we've found among the Hittite archives. Just a king trying to make sense of this unprecedented suffering through the resources of his own theological tradition. The plague lasted for 2 decades and killed an unknown but clearly an enormous number of people. It was, in its way, the price of an empire. The connectivity that makes a great state powerful is also what makes it vulnerable to the diseases of the populations it conquers. So let's talk about Mursili II. He inherited from his father both the most powerful position in the Hittite state that they had ever occupied and the most severe crisis it had ever faced, at least since the dark age of the old Hittite kingdom. The plague was still killing people. That was the immediate problem. The empire's recently conquered Syrian territories were not quite impressed with their new rulers. The Arzawa kingdoms of western Anatolia, which Suppiluliuma had pacified, had used the distraction of the plague years to reassert their independence. Kaskas, the tribal confederation of the Black Sea coast that was the Hittites' most persistent and most dangerous northern enemy, had raided into the Anatolian heartland. And Mursili was young, probably in his early 20s at his accession, and without the military reputation that allowed his father to command immediate respect. He spent the next 25 years making one. The annals of Mursili II are the most complete surviving account of military campaigns in Hittite history, and they reveal a king of extraordinary energy. In a career spanning roughly 30 years, he campaigned in western Anatolia, suppressing the Arzawa kingdoms in a series of operations that were notable for the scale of deportations he conducted, moving populations between regions on a scale that reflects a strategic understanding of how to reduce the military capacity of a conquered territory by dispersing the communities that had sustained resistance. He campaigned repeatedly in the north against Cascas, in operations that he himself acknowledged were never definitively conclusive. The Cascas were expert raiders who could melt into their forested terrain whenever the Hittite army appeared in force, requiring a strategy of repeated pressure rather than the decisive engagement that could end a war. He campaigned in Syria to consolidate the position his father had established, fighting a major war against the Nuhas and its allies, defeating an Egyptian-backed coalition at Kadesh, which was the same Kadesh whose name would become famous 2 generations later. Don't get confused. In a campaign that established Hittite dominance over the northern Levant more thoroughly than Suppiluliuma's original conquests had imagined. What the annals also reveal, particularly in the prayers and the more personal sections of his historical writings, is a man who thought carefully about the relationship between divine will and historical causation, who was not simply reporting his victories, but genuinely trying to understand why things happened as they did. The plague prayers, the most famous of his personal documents, are not simply requests for divine intervention, but they are theological arguments in which Mursili systematically examines the possible reasons why the gods might have allowed all this to happen. He considers each explanation on the basis of available evidence and concludes that the most likely cause is a sin of omission by his father in failing to perform the certain required rituals. The intellectual quality of this exercise is pretty striking by any standard. It's the willingness to consider multiple explanations, to weigh evidence, to arrive at a conclusion that implicates a revered predecessor, rather than simply just blaming the external enemies. It's frankly pretty impressive. The introspection. It's what a good ruler should be doing. Right. Anyway, under Mursili II and his successors, the Hittite Empire entered its period of greatest sophistication as a diplomatic and administrative entity. The network of vassal states that radiated out from Hattusa in Anatolia, Syria, the Levantine coast, were managed through a system of treaties whose form and content were remarkably standardized, reflecting a bureaucratic tradition that had developed detailed protocols for exactly what a relationship of overlord and vassal would entail. The vassal treaties are among the most studied documents, not only for what they reveal about Hittite political thinking, but because of their structure. The historical prologue, the stipulations, divine weaknesses, the blessings, the curses. It's been compared to the structure of the biblical covenant texts, a comparison whose implications for understanding the origins of certain Old World Testament theological concepts have generated decades of academic debate. Now, whether or not the comparison illuminates biblical origins, it certainly illuminates the sophistication of the Hittite legal and diplomatic tradition. The great power correspondence of this period, the Amarna letters, for example, discovered in Egypt in 1887, which preserve a generation of diplomatic correspondence between the major Near Eastern states, places the Hittites in their international context, with a clarity that royal annals can't really provide. The letter writers call each other brother. They exchange gifts with a formulaic reciprocity that is simultaneously courteous and precisely calibrated to express relative status. complain with engaging frankness about delays in gift deliveries, request gold physicians, craftsmen, brides, and discuss the business of maintaining friendly relations between powerful states and in language that would be recognizable to any modern diplomat. The Hittites under Superlulium I and his successors were full participants in this system, both as senders and receivers of this fraternal correspondence. What emerges from the Amarna archive is a portrait of a Near Eastern diplomatic community, in which the Hittites were neither newcomers nor subordinates, but established members of the most exclusive club that the ancient world had to offer. The administrative center of this empire was Hattusa itself, the city Anita had cursed, and Hattusili I had chosen to make his capital anyway. Archaeological excavation at Bogaskoye, which has continued intermittently since Winkler's first excavation in 1906, has revealed a city of impressive scale and sophistication. At its height, Hattusa covered approximately 180 hectares within its walls whose circuit is roughly 6 kilometers, incorporated a series of massive gates decorated with stone reliefs of lions, sphinxes, and warriors that are among the finest surviving examples of Hittite monumental art. The city was divided into a lower town, with the main temples and administrative buildings built on an upper city, and what appears to have been a planned expansion under the late Empire kings. The great temple of the storm god, whose massive storage facilities for provisions, oil, luxury goods, tells about the economic role of the temples as well as their religious function. It's one of the largest religious structures of the Bronze Age. And then we have the rock sanctuary of Yazilka, located in a kilometer outside the walls. It contains the finest surviving examples of Hittite relief sculpture, a procession of 72 divine figures carved into the living rock, meeting in divine assembly in a natural outdoor gallery whose full ceremonial function is still debated, but whose visual power 3,000 years later is quite unmistakable. And the other unmistakable and perhaps quintessential event in the Hittite historiography is the Battle of Kadesh, fought in the 5th year of the reign of Ramesses II, about 1274 BCE by most calculations. The best documented battle of the ancient world, which is in itself quite a remarkable thing, because it was fought to no military conclusion. I mean, Ramesses kind of drummed it up a little bit, but yeah. Well, both sides subsequently claimed victory with a conviction and a documentary thoroughness has provided historians with an unusual rich body of evidence for the conduct and aftermath of a Bronze Age military engagement, while simultaneously demonstrating how thoroughly ancient propaganda could decouple from the reality. The Egyptian version of the battle, preserved in 5 separate monumental inscriptions, plus a literary poem, presents Ramesses as this heroic warrior who defeated the Hittite army in single-handed combat after his troops had fled. But the Hittite version, pieced together from the diplomatic correspondence and the political context, presents a rather different picture. The actual battle, insofar as it can be reconstructed, was a near disaster for both sides, and well, it just was a Pyrrhic victory, if anything, if anyone won at all. The immediate context of Kadesh was a decade of Hittite-Egyptian tension over control of Syria. The Hittite king Muwatalli II, who was Mursali's son, had been consolidating Hittite control over the northern Levant and extending pressure southward into territory that Egypt considered a sphere of influence. Ramesses II, newly come to the throne of Egypt and eager to establish a military reputation, led a campaign northward in 1274 with the explicit objective of getting Kadesh, the city of Homs in modern geography, which commanded the crucial pass between the Orontes Valley and the route to the Euphrates. So it was a pretty important place. Now Muwatalli assembled a coalition army that ancient sources claim to reach 37,000 men, though the actual figure is probably lower than that. Ramesses led an Egyptian army of perhaps 20,000, organized in 4 divisions named after the Egyptian gods, Re, Amun, Ta, and Set. The battle almost ended before it properly began, through an intelligence failure of remarkable consequence. You see, there were 2 scouts captured by Egyptian forces, and they told Ramesses that the Hittite army was far to the north, near Aleppo, and had not yet reached Kadesh. On the basis of that information, which was false, planted deliberately by Muwatalli, Ramesses advanced with the Amun division, which sounds cool, the Amun division, isn't that cool? Without waiting for the rest of his army to close up behind him. Well, when the truth became apparent, the Hittite chariot force had already crossed the Orontes River and was striking the Ra division from the flank, destroying it and driving its survivors into the Amun division's camp in a complete chaos. Ramesses found himself with 1 division, part of another, in a rout. When the Hittite chariots inside his camp, the situation was looking, by his own subsequent account stripped of its embellishment, quite catastrophic. What happened next is where the Egyptian and Hittite sources diverge most dramatically. The Egyptian account, most famously the literary version known as the poem of Pentar, describes Ramesses personally charging the Hittite chariots, calling on Amun, and defeating them through divine assistance and personal heroism in a passage of considerable rhetorical power that reads like the ancient equivalent of like an action film. Yeah, it's a bit, it's a little bit drummed up. I think Ramesses was looking over the shoulder of the scribe as he was writing that one down. Ooh, add in a part where I stand on top of a giant pile of Hittite bodies and start screaming at the gods or something. Who knows? Now there is the less mythologized reading of what sources collectively suggest is that the Hittite chariot crews, having penetrated the Egyptian camp, stopped to plunder it rather than pressing their tactical advantage, an error that gave Ramesses enough time for the Tar division to arrive from the south and stabilize the Egyptian position. A Hittite second wave was not committed in time to be decisive, for reasons that the Hittite sources don't fully explain to us. Well, by nightfall, neither side had achieved a breakthrough. Both sides had suffered significant casualties, and Muwatalli had not captured Kadesh. The following day, negotiations of some kind appeared to have taken place, and both armies withdrew. The consequences for the battle were essentially nil, at least in the short term. The frontier between the the Hittite and Egyptian spheres of influence remained pretty much where it had been before the campaign. But the political consequences, they were substantial. In Egypt, the propagandistic presentation of Kadesh is a great victory served in Ramesses' domestic political purposes, and it established the iconographic tradition of the warrior pharaoh, whose image would dominate royal art for the remainder of his reign. In Hatti, the failure to defeat Egypt decisively was absorbed into a political calculation that recognized the limits of Hittite power in the south and the advantages of a stable settlement. The subsequent years saw continued low-level conflict and diplomatic maneuvering, with Muwatalli's successors, including his brother Hattusa III, who had overthrown Muwatalli's son Uri-Teshub-Nipal's coup, gradually moving toward the diplomatic resolution that Kadesh's military inconclusiveness had made ultimately inevitable. the figure of Puddaheppa, Hattusa III's queen, the daughter of a priest of the goddess of Shaushka from Kazuatna, and one of the most remarkable women to appear in any ancient record, deserves a bit of attention in her own right, rather than simply as a detail in the diplomatic story. The Egyptian-Hittite correspondence preserved in the Hittite archive includes letters written by Puddaheppa herself, and the tone is interesting because she corresponds with Ramesses II as an equal, rebukes him gently when she finds his requests to be excessive, and manages the negotiations over her daughter's diplomatic marriage to Egypt with the confidence of someone who understood precisely what was being exchanged and how valuable it was. One letter, responding to the Egyptian pressure to finalize arrangements more quickly, explains with impressive patience why the Hittites cannot deliver the princess on the schedule that Egypt is demanding. There's been a religious festival, there's illness, and there's been the business of assembling an appropriate dowry. And the explanation has the quality of a head of state buying time in a negotiation, not a subordinate apologizing for some failure to meet a deadline. The treaty itself was formally sealed, in Puddaheppa's version of events, in the presence of the gods and both countries, and the divine witness list in the Hittite text includes both the storm god of Hatti and the sun goddess of Arina. The latter a goddess whose cult Puddaheppa was particularly associated with, and whose temples she patronized through her long career. The sun goddess of Arina was the chief goddess of the Hittite state, preeminent along all the divine beings whose goodwill the empire depended upon, and Puddaheppa's identification with her patronage gave the queen a religious authority that complemented rather than merely supported the king's political and military power. She's one of the few women in the ancient Near East whose personal seal, inscribed with her own name and titles, survives in substantial numbers, a material testimony to a genuine administrative role rather than just a ceremonial one. Well, the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty of approximately 1259, negotiated between Ramesses II and Hattusa III, and preserved in versions from both sides, is the oldest surviving international peace treaty, for which we have both parties' versions. Its terms established the frontier between the two empire spheres of influence in Syria, provided for mutual extradition of political refugees, pledged military assistance in case of a third-party attack or internal rebellion, and invoked as witnesses a comprehensive list of the Egyptian and Hittite gods. The divine witness list is itself a document of considerable interest, by including the gods of both parties as guarantors of the agreement. It reflected a sophisticated understanding that a treaty between two great powers is more durable when its divine legitimation is shared rather than unilateral. The treaty was followed by a dynastic marriage. Hattusa sent his daughter to Egypt as a wife for Ramesses, and by the remarkable series of letters preserved in the Hittite archive between the Egyptian and Hittite courts, including a request from Ramesses for a Hittite physician to help with fertility problems at the Egyptian court, and the warm correspondence between the Egyptian queen Nefertari and the Hittite queen Puddaheppa that speaks of a friendship and sisterhood with a directness that suggests the diplomatic formula had, for those two women at least, some personal reality behind it. No, and not to mention that peace treaty, they've still got it hung up in the United Nations today. That's pretty interesting. The century between the peace treaty with Egypt and the final collapse of the Hittite Empire around 1200 is a period of increasing strain, whose specific causes are still up for anyone's debate. But the general contours are clear enough. The empire that Suppiluliuma had built, and that Mursili II had consolidated, was, by the reign of Tudalia IV in the mid-13th century, a little pressured on multiple fronts. so pressured that its administrative and military systems were finding it quite difficult to manage things simultaneously. The successors of Hattusili III, whose own accession through the overthrow of his nephew Teshub, had introduced a new succession, uncertainty into the Hittite royal line, faced an Assyria that was growing steadily and more powerful in the east, a Kassite Babylon that required careful management to the southeast, and restive vassals in Syria and Anatolia, who frankly saw Hittite weakness opportunities for reassertion and, well, beginning to appear on the horizon by the reign of Tudalia IV, the first evidence of large-scale population movements that would accelerate into that catastrophe of 1200. The internal tensions of the late empire are particularly visible in the correspondence and administrative records of the period. A series of letters from the Hittite king to the king of Ugarit, the prosperous trading city on the Syrian coast, whose archive at Ras Shamra has provided some of the most important documentary evidence for the Late Bronze Age. They revealed a court of the Hittites increasingly concerned about food supplies and requesting substantial shipments of food from Ugarit and other Levantine cities. Famine, or at least a serious food shortage, appears to have been a significant factor in the empire's final days. Whether this was caused by the climate or by the disruption of the agricultural systems that supported Hittite Anatolia, or perhaps by the logistical strain of maintaining large armies on multiple fronts, the food shortage was very real, and the political consequences were serious. The most dramatic evidence for the speed and totality of the Bronze Age collapse comes from the Ugaritic archive itself. Among the last documents recovered from Ras Shamra, before the city was destroyed and never rebuilt, is a letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia, i.e. Cyprus, describing an attack by ships and requesting help. These sea peoples, or at least the maritime components of the population movements. The letter, however, was never sent. It was still found in the kiln when it was being fired, and the city was destroyed. Another letter from the same archive, from the Hittite king, probably Suppiluliuma II, the last documented great Hittite king, to the king of Ugarit is a request for grain, urgent, specific, and reflects the food crisis that the Hittite heartland was experiencing, rather panicked, begging for assistance. And then there was a third letter from the king of Ugarit to an unspecified correspondent. It describes enemy ships at sea, the city burning, the absence of any available Ugaritic military force to respond. These three documents, found together in the ruins of a city that was never rebuilt after approximately 1185, constitute a kind of time capsule of the catastrophe. It's the food crisis, the raiders, the military helplessness, the diplomatic appeals going unanswered, all compressed into a few clay tablets, fired by the destruction that killed the civilization that had made them. The Hittite archive at Bogaskoi ends similarly. The last tablets were being written when the city was destroyed, and the destruction that ended the archive preserved it, because the burning of the administrative buildings fired the clay tablets that would have otherwise been dissolved back into the earth. Kind of ironic, isn't it? The political history of the late empire is complicated by the revival of a succession problem that Telepinu's edict had not permanently solved. Hattusili III had established his own branch of the royal family in power through the overthrow of Teshub, but the dispossessed branch did not simply accept this. Teshub went into exile and appears to have spent a few years in Egypt, where he was received as a guest and used as a diplomatic counter by Ramesses II in his occasional disputes with Hattusili. The correspondence about Teshub's status and the demand for his extradition runs through the diplomatic archive for decades, a persistent irritant in Hittite-Egyptian relations that the peace treaty had not fully resolved. He was almost like some kind of Hittite version of Julian Assange. Maybe, without all the state secrets being leaked, but hey, who knows what he was telling the Egyptians to get a bit of extra food or whatever other pleasantries the Egyptian palace could offer to him. Now, within Hatti itself, the question of which branch of the royal family had legitimate claim to the throne continued to generate tensions whose destabilizing potential would become acute in the empire's final years. Tudalia IV, the last of the great Hittite kings, responded to the empire's difficulties with an impressive combination of military campaigning and religious intensification. The sanctuary of Yazilikaya, with its extraordinary rock reliefs and divine assembly of the private chamber, contained the relief of Tudalia IV in the embrace of the god Sharuma, one of the most striking images of a divine royal protection in ancient art, by the way, appears to have been expanded and elaborated under his direction as part of a broader religious program aimed at securing divine support for a beleaguered empire. His military campaigns reasserted Hittite control over Cyprus, which had been developing as a semi-independent trading entity, and maintained the pressure on Assyria that prevented its expansion westward into the Hittite sphere. But unfortunately, the pressures were multiplying faster than they could be addressed. Too many problems and not enough solutions. And so the end came, with a speed and thoroughness that sources could barely describe, and that subsequent scholarship has spent decades trying to make sense of. Around 1200, or more precisely in the decades on either side of that date, the Hittite Empire collapsed. Hattusa itself was destroyed. Its great temples and palaces were burned and its population dispersed. The destruction was not the work of a single enemy. The evidence suggests a combination of factors, including raids by the peoples the Egyptian sources called the Sea Peoples, a large-scale population movement from the Aegean and Balkans. A little complicated. We did another video about it. It's a story for another time. But also possibly by internal revolt, by subject peoples taking advantage of the imperial center's weakness. The Kaskas of the Black Sea coast, the Hittites' oldest and most persistent enemies, may have delivered the final blow to Hattusa itself, following a pattern that the city had experienced before during periods of Hittite weakness. Now, the Bronze Age collapse, of which the Hittite Empire's destruction was one component, is one of the great unsolved problems that we have of the Bronze Age. In the space of roughly 50 years, around 1200, most of the major palace economies of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Ugaritic city-states, the cities at Cyprus, a couple of Levantine urban centers, well, they all ended up destroyed, and the entire interconnected system of long-distance trade and diplomatic exchange that had characterized this golden age of the Bronze Age times had ceased to function. Egypt, though, survived. Barely, but they survived, holding on by the tips of their fingers. But they emerged from this crisis a significantly diminished power. They never really recovered their former reach. The period that followed, sometimes called the Early Iron Age, Dark Age, was characterized by population decline, reduced trade, the disappearance of monuments, and the loss of writing in regions where the Mycenaean Linear B script had been in use. Another little mystery. The causes that scholars have proposed for this catastrophe include climate change and associated drought, migration and invasion by those sea peoples, internal rebellions by subject populations, and systematic vulnerabilities of the highly interdependent palace economies themselves, an overconnected system in which the failure of one node could cascade through the entire network. Well, the honest answer is that the collapse was multi-causal, probably, with different factors predominating in different regions. and each factor amplifying the other. But what about the Hittite tradition? Well, that didn't entirely disappear. In northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, a number of successor states, the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, as we call them in modern scholarship, maintained elements of Hittite culture, art, and political tradition for 7 centuries after the empire's fall. Cities like Carchemish, Malatya, and Tel Halaf served as centers of distinctive hybrid culture that preserved the Hittite iconographic traditions, used a hieroglyphic script derived from the Hittite writing system, and maintained royal lineages that claimed connection to the Hittite imperial tradition. These Neo-Hittite states appeared prominently in the Hebrew Bible. The Hittites of the Old Testament are almost certainly references to these first millennium successor states rather than the Bronze Age empire, and they remain significant political entities in the Levant until they were progressively absorbed by the expanding Assyrian Empire in the 9th and 8th centuries. The last of them fell to the Assyrians around 700 BCE, and after that, the Hittite tradition was well and truly over. Its memory preserved only in the fragmentary references of other peoples and in the clay tablets that lay buried under the ruins of Hattusa, waiting for a curious German archaeologist to pull them out of the ground 2,500 years later. Well, speaking of thousands of years later, here we are. But I suppose the first major breakthrough came from a direction that no one had really anticipated, and that's from the Old Testament. Let's rewind about 150 years. Actually, is it exactly 150? I think it is exactly 150 years. 1876. Is it? Oh, it's going to be embarrassing if my maths are wrong. Anyway, the British scholar A.H. Sayce proposed, on the basis of the comparison between the Egyptian descriptions and the Kheta and certain hieroglyphic inscriptions found at sites across Anatolia and northern Syria, that the Hittites of the Hebrew Bible and the Kheta of the Egyptian records were indeed the same people, and that they had built their empire in Anatolia. The proposal was a little controversial at the time, but, the scholars, they'd found it implausible that a people this powerful and well documented in the Egyptian sources could have left no trace in classical Greek and Roman tradition, and were essentially unknown to the modern world. And it's a fair point. But the controversy would continue until Winkler's excavations at Bozokoy from 1906 onward, and that would produce the documentary evidence that settled the question definitively. Tens of thousands of clay tablets in the archive of Hattusa, and that confirmed beyond any doubt that right here was the Hittite capital, and that the Kheta of the Egyptians and the Hatti of the Assyrians were the inhabitants of this city, and that the Hittites had indeed been one of the great empires of the Bronze Age. The decipherment began by 1915 by one Bedřich Hrozny, and the second great breakthrough was done. Its method deserves a bit of attention. The Hittite tablets were in cuneiform, you see, a writing system that could be borrowed across language boundaries, and the cuneiform signs had values established through earlier decipherment of Akkadian. Now this meant that the Hittite tablets could be read phonetically, even before their meaning was understood. Hrozny, working with the phonetic readings of the signs, noticed a particular Hittite sentence that contained a sign, Ninda, which in Akkadian scribal convention stood for bread, and that verbs following it bore a structural resemblance to Latin and Germanic forms for eating and drinking. Now if Ninda meant bread, and the language was Indo-European, then Esateni, also contained in the sentence, meant something like you eat, and Ekudeni meant something like you drink. Working outward from this, with a bit of rigor, Hrozny demonstrated that Hittite was indeed an Indo-European language. the most archaic Indo-European language known, whose analysis requires a revision of the established understanding of how the language family had developed. And with all of that, here we are. And I think we do have to acknowledge the works of scholarship, ending our history of the Hittites with that is a good way to think about the future, because the story's not quite finished. You see, the Hittites themselves were perpetually aware of the incompleteness of their understanding. Their prayers addressed the gods with a deference that acknowledges the limits of human knowledge about divine intention. Well, the plague prayers of Mercilli, which a king systematically examines the possible causes of this divine displeasure and arrives at conclusions that implicate his own family, they're the product of a tradition that believed that it didn't quite have all the answers. They are the product of a tradition that believed the questions were worth asking, that the relationship between the human and divine required constant attention and honest examination. And 3,000 years after the collapse of the empire they built, and after 3,000 years of near total oblivion, the Hittites still might surprise us. This approach of systematic inquiry and a bit of imagination that we have to keep in mind. Because if we can find all of these tablets buried under the ground, what else is still there? Who knows if, in the final days of the panic of the Hittites, that other royal archives, the real good stuff, was moved off to somewhere and buried in the hopes that one day someone would find it. Somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. Well, they didn't want the sea peoples or those unwelcome newcomers to find it, so perhaps they're crossing their fingers that we find it. I hope so. So let's all keep our minds open and our fingers crossed. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me on our history of the Hittites. A fascinating people, that's for sure. In popular memory, the Hittites are those mighty warriors, the foes of the pharaohs. But behind all of the grand battles and the treaties that we have left hanging up in the UN to this very day were the ordinary people of the Hittite Empire, the ones who lived out their daily routines in the towns and villages of Anatolia. What was life like for them? What did they do all day? What did they believe? What did they eat? What did they wear? That's what we're here to talk about today. Very normal matters of very normal people. Hello and welcome. I hope you are enjoying the Daily Life series as much as we are enjoying doing it for you. And thank you once again to those supporting on the Patreon, YouTube memberships, donations, and the merch store, keeping everything ad-free. Links are in the description. Otherwise, give it a like, comment, and subscribe. Boosts us up in the algorithm. Really does help. Any case, with all that being said and done, let's waste no more time and get straight into it. First off, like in a lot of other places, Hittite Anatolia's daily life was shaped by the geography and climate. Look at it like this. The Hittite heartland in central Anatolia is a bit unique. It's a high plateau ringed by mountains. The summers, hot and dry, but the winters brought biting cold and a bit of snow from time to time, conditions mentioned in Hittite texts and still familiar in modern Turkey. Now, these extremes meant that the agricultural cycles and daily routines had to adjust to seasonal rhythms. When spring came, the melting snow swelled the streams, and farmers raced to plow and sow the fields. In autumn, communities gathered to harvest before the winter's onset. The landscape itself was a mix of forests, rocky highlands, and fertile river valleys. Scattered across this terrain were villages and towns built of mud brick and stone, with Hattusa, the great city as the bustling royal capital. Now, we did another video specifically on Hattusa. If you want to see that, you can just search it up, you'll find it. Now, most Hittites lived in small agrarian villages rather than cities. Traveling between settlements, though, that could be quite arduous. Dirt roads, where there were roads, winding down mountain passes. Not ideal. Life for many was locally centered because of this, in tight-knit communities, often bound by kinship. Ethnically and linguistically, the Hittite world was also quite diverse. The ruling class spoke Hittite, the language, an Indo-European branch of languages, but they coexisted with many other groups. Names in use suggest that people of Luwian and Hurrian heritage lived among the Hittite stock. The empire had grown by conquest and diplomacy, absorbing the older Hattian people of Anatolia, and later ruling over Hurrians, Luwians, and others. Thus, a typical Hittite town might have a mix of traditions, a reflection of centuries of cultural blending. Despite this diversity, inhabitants shared a strong identity as people of Hatti, loyal to the great king in Hattusa. In fact, one could be Hittite by allegiance, even if you weren't by blood. A person in the late Bronze Age Anatolian region might call the storm god Tarhunna in Hittite, Teshub in Hurrian, or if you were in a little local village, you might have a different name. But it's all for the same deity, and all in the same prayer. What really bound people together was the imperial administration and the Hittite state laws and institutions that applied to everyone. What this managed to do was foster a sense of order across the land, well, as much as can be in realistic terms for the time. Socially, Hittite society was hierarchical, but not rigidly caste-bound. At the top, there was the king. He was titled in Hittite Tabarna or Labarna, who was not only the head of the state, but also chief priest of the realm. You'll find this in many other Bronze Age cultures. The king's extended family and the nobility formed an elite class, living in palaces or large estates. Just below them were the officials and regional governors, for example, the chief of the royal bodyguards, the chief of scribes, and the chief of wine stewards, each with different duties. These positions show that governance was somewhat decentralized. You see, even a great king like Suppiluliuma I or Hattusili III relied on bureaucracy of literate administrators and skilled professionals. Common free citizens did form the bulk of the population, of course, that goes without saying. The farmers, herders, craftsmen, soldiers, and merchants who sustained the economy. They were the foundation of Hittite society. And they were typically bound by duty to the king. But they could also own land or businesses, as long as they paid their taxes and did their proper military service, that is. But below that were the bottom of the social ladder, the slaves and the war captives. Hittite slaves were often prisoners taken in foreign campaigns, or their descendants. However, Hittite laws granted slaves some protections and freedoms that might surprise us today. For instance, slaves in Hatti could marry whom they chose. They could even own property. And if they managed to save up enough money, they could purchase their freedom. This relatively humane treatment, noted by scholars, reflects the practical, family-centered outlook of Hittite law. It was a society stratified by rank and wealth, yet one where even those of low status had certain rights under the law. The population density of Hittite Anatolia was not high, at least by modern standards. Villages might consist of a few dozen families. Towns, perhaps a few thousand people. The capital Hattusa, in its heyday around the 13th century BCE, covered a vast area behind its defensive walls. Archaeologists have traced a circuit of over 8 kilometers of fortifications, but much of the enclosed space was taken up by temples, palaces, storerooms, and open ground. Scholars estimate Hattusa's population may have been in the tens of thousands at most, and that means that even the big city of the Hittite Empire would feel more like a modest town by modern comparison. But of course, we're not going to be judging it by that, aren't we? Streets were winding and unpaved, lined with mud brick dwellings. Livestock roamed the outskirts. Nevertheless, Hattusa impressed visitors with its massive stone walls and gates carved with lions and sphinxes. Monumental gates like the famous Lion Gate, flanked by snarling sculptures, and King's Gate, showed the might of the state. But just inside these gates lay the ordinary city quarters where bakers, potters, and scribes went about their daily business. Life in the countryside, however, revolved around the village. A typical Hittite village consisted of mud brick homes with courtyards, clustered on a hillside or near a stream. Each household might have a small garden or orchard and keep a few animals, goats, sheep, that is the plural, maybe a cow or two. Cows, of course, were a little bit more valuable than the smaller livestock. The surrounding fields, collectively worked, produced the staples: emmer wheat and barley for bread and beer, flax for linen and fodder for animals. The Hittites were indeed primarily farmers and herders, and they knew the uncertainties of their environment. Droughts, crop blights, or early frosts could bring hardship. One Hittite prayer text dramatically describes a plague that ravaged the land for 20 years in the reign of King Mursili II, a grim reminder of how vulnerable even a great kingdom was to disease and famine. No one gets away with that. But in normal times, villagers were largely self-sufficient. Neighbors would help each other with big tasks like harvesting or building, and bartering. Let's have the evening on my mind. Bartering of goods was common. So in these close communities, everyone knew everybody else, and social life often centered on extended families and seasonal festivals. But all this being said, it's important to note that much of what we know about Hittite daily life is reconstructed from pretty scant evidence. We just have to do our best with what we have. But, everyone is doing their best, so lucky for us. The Hittites left behind tens of thousands of clay tablets, sure, but most of them are royal archives. Treaties, laws, religious rituals, oracle reports. No one was really writing down the personal diaries or letters about daily chores. We do catch occasional glimpses, though. A letter complaining about a shortage of beer, an inventory in a noble's household, or a king's instructions to his farmers. As for the other details, archaeology needs to fill those in. The remains of houses, tools, pottery, and even the bones of meals. Now, from these pieces we assemble the mosaic of everyday Hittite existence. So, with that background of land and society in mind, let's walk through the facets of daily lives, and we'll see if we can get a little picture in our mind. The typical Hittite home was modest by modern standards, usually a single-story structure of mud brick walls on stone foundations. Roofs were flat and made of timber beams covered with reeds and clay. Well, you didn't really have windows, but you did have small openings, designed to keep out the winter cold and summer heat. Floors were often packed earth, though there were a few wealthier homes that might have stone paving. Furnishings were pretty few. Woven mats or low wooden stools, a couple clay jars for storage, maybe a wooden chest. Most people slept on mats or blankets laid on the floor, or on simple wooden bedsteads, if they could afford them. A Hittite household was usually extended family in structure. Several generations might live under one roof, or in adjacent houses around a shared courtyard. Maybe Granddad was living there who had cleared the land earlier, his grown sons and wives with him, and a gaggle of children. It could easily number up to 10 to 15 people, plus a dependent relative or a hired servant. It wasn't uncommon for 10 or 20 more people to share a household compound, especially if the family was prosperous and had farm laborers or slaves living in. In the evenings, such a household would gather for the main meal, seated in a circle if space allowed, sharing food from common bowls. And Hittites valued highly family bonds too, Sons and daughters were both cherished. One Hittite instruction text advises the head of the household to treat children well and raise them to be honorable, showing an expectation that each generation would have to care for the next. Childhood could be pretty precarious. Infant mortality was high, as in, all ancient societies, so surviving past the age of 5 was a cause for a quiet celebration. By the age of 6 or 7, children were expected to start learning the skills they would need as adults. A boy might accompany his father to the fields or workshop, gradually taking on chores like fetching water, herding sheep, or kneading clay for pottery. As for a girl, she might shadow her mother in domestic tasks, learning to spin wool or weave cloth on the upright loom, not to mention cooking basic meals. And speaking of education, in its formal sense was quite reserved for a select few. Only a minority of Hittites, mostly the children of elite families or professional scribes, became literate. For those lucky enough to attend a scribal school, the curriculum was pretty harsh. They had to master not only Hittite language, but also Akkadian and Sumerian, and the complex cuneiform writing system. Royal edicts mention chief of the scribes as an important official, which implies a whole scribal apparatus of trainers and apprentices. A literate boy might start as a trainee around, 7 or 8 years old. He'd spend years copying tablets, and only in his late teens or 20s would he become a full-fledged scribe. And that was a big deal, of course. Literacy truly was a specialized career path, often hereditary. For the average child, however, education was practical and on the job. The family profession, that was the classroom. If your dad was a farmer, you were a farmer. But women played vital roles too within the family and beyond. A Hittite woman typically married in her teens, and upon marriage she donned a veil if she was of the free class. Veiling signified her married status, a custom also seen in some neighboring cultures. Women usually took charge of running the household. They cooked, cleaned, fetched water, and cared for children. And they also managed the storage of food, which of course is, if you starve to death, it's all over, isn't it? So of course it's very important. They were also often involved in the family's economic activity. For example, women were the primary weavers and cloth makers, a central industry in Hatti. In farm families, women milked animals, made butter and cheese, and tended vegetable gardens. Despite a clear patriarchal structure, the father, husband, was typically the head of the household, Hittite laws indicate that women had significant rights of their own. For example, a wife could own dowry property and maintain control over it, and widows could inherit their husband's estate. That's if there were no adult sons. We even have one text that implies daughters could inherit if a man had no sons, that is, which was not unheard of in the ancient Near East. There's a few other cultures, Akkadian culture as well as one of them, which has this kind of rule. Furthermore, some women served in official or semi-official capacities. There were priestesses, prophetesses, and in the royal court, you had the queen, of course, and she wielded considerable power, the top job for any woman of Hittite society. She'd also act as a high priestess, and sometimes a co-regent with the king, especially if the king was young, a little bit too young before his coming of age to be considered wise enough to make good decisions. Now, notably, Queen Pudaepa in the 13th century BCE corresponded as an equal with Pharaoh Ramesses II and took part in state treaties, evidence that elite women could be very influential. While the average Hittite woman led a life centered on home and family, she was far from powerless. In daily life, the partnership of husband and wife was crucial for survival. The inscription suggests mutual respect. A husband was expected to provide and protect for the wife, and in turn, the wives are described as running the house diligently. Now, the next part we're going to talk about is a bit of clothing and appearance standards. How do you spot a Hittite among the crowd? Their clothing reflected both their practical needs but also social customs. Surviving art and texts give us a fairly detailed idea of how they dressed. As for the men, they typically wore a kilt or a tunic as the basic garment. A common style was a knee-length tunic with short sleeves, belted at the waist with a strip of cloth or leather. In warm weather, a simple wraparound kilt, a bit like a skirt made of a rectangle of fabric, might be worn instead. The fabric was usually wool for cooler seasons, perhaps flax linen for summer. Women wore longer dresses, generally reaching the ankles. A woman's dress could be a wraparound garment, a sewn gown with sleeves perhaps. One typical depiction shows women in a kind of long tunic dress cinched with a belt, sometimes with a short cape or shawl over their shoulders. Importantly, a married woman veiled her hair in public. One Hittite word for a married woman was even synonymous with veiled one. As for this veil, it might have been a light cloth draped over the head and tied or simply left hanging, serving to signify her marital status, but also her modesty. As for the unmarried girls, they probably didn't cover their heads fully, but they might wear headscarves or headbands. Both men and women might don cloaks in colder weather, heavy woolen cloaks or mantles that could be pinned at the shoulder. There's evidence of colorful dyes being used as well. Hittite texts mention red, yellow, blue, green, black, and white garments. The wealthy could afford bright dyes, and even imported the coveted purple cloth from the region of Lesbos or the Levant, a luxury item in that era. And indeed it was. Actually, it was the most expensive. It's very difficult to get purple dye. Well, not these days. But back in those days it certainly was. The Hittites certainly had their own distinctive flair in dress. One famous item noted by historians is the shoe with the upturned toes. Hittite shoes or boots often had a curled up tip, almost like think of it like a small horn at the toe. It could be seen on statues and carvings. These upturned shoes might have helped keep the toes from snagging on uneven ground. Or they might have simply just been a fashion statement of the time. I suppose we'll never know. Later, Greek legend even attributed such shoes to Trojan style, which likely derived from Hittite-influenced Anatolia. For practical daily use, footwear would be sturdy leather, or kind of low boots. The upturned feature perhaps more pronounced in the formal or elite attire, but the day-to-day was pretty much a sandal-type shoe. As for the men, they were usually clean-shaven, or they had short beards. according to Egyptian depictions of the Hittites and Hittite seal images. By the 13th century BCE, Hittite kings are shown with no beard at all, unlike many Mesopotamian kings, a trend that suggests clean-shavenness was preferred for a more dignified look. As for the hair, they kept that around shoulder length, sometimes with a ribbon or a band. Hittite women are shown with their hair very long, often reaching past the shoulders, either braided or gathered under a veil or scarf. Jewelry and adornment were pretty popular among most social classes. Everyone liked to display a bit of finery if they could afford it. Common people might wear simple strings of beads or copper bangles, whereas the upper class had access to things like gold, silver, precious stones. Excavations in Hittite levels have uncovered lots of faience and glass beads, carnelian and agate stones, and also bronze pins and earrings. The variety is pretty impressive. A typical Hittite woman of means might wear a necklace of beads, large hoop earrings, and pins to fasten her clothing, sometimes with decorative heads, etc., shaped like flowers or animals, things like this. As for the men of higher status, they wore seal rings or pendants. The cylinder seal or stamp used to sign documents often hung on a cord around the neck or wrist. Hittite seals were beautifully engraved and served as both identification and jewelry. But clothing also denoted profession or role at times. For example, Hittite priests and priestesses wore distinctive garb during ceremonies, often long white robes, sometimes with peculiar hats too. There's also one famous Hittite image from a rock sanctuary. It shows gods and goddesses, and by extension the priests representing them. And they've all got these tall, kind of conical hats and long robes. It's quite cool. Now, in daily life, a farmer might throw on a broad-brimmed hat of felt against the sun. Or a soldier might don a leather helmet or a cloak before a journey. Practical concerns. A striking point is, however, how purely decorative clothing we see. Almost everything had a purpose. On the layers of wool, the headscarves, the stout belts and shoes, they were all suited to a land of harsh weather, and for the majority of people, harsh work. So let's get away from that now and talk about the Hittite diet. And at the core of that was bread. So central, in fact, that the Hittite word for bread, ninda, simply meant food in general. Every Hittite household, all the way from the farmstead to the palace, was baking bread regularly. The grain of choice was wheat, especially emmer wheat. But if you couldn't get that, you'd make it out of barley. Dough was often leavened and baked in dome-shaped clay ovens. Flatbreads were also made on griddles and hot stones. There were many varieties of bread, as ancient Hittite texts do tell us. Sometimes mentioned include sour bread, perhaps made with a sourdough starter, flatbread, honey bread, and others with intriguing names like moon bread or spear bread. These last names hint at shapes. You can imagine spear bread, I suppose, as a kind of like a baguette, and moon bread as like a crescent-shaped roll, like a croissant, which actually means crescent, by the way. Well, another reminder too that even back then the bakers were getting creative. Bread could also be made from lentils or beans mixed into flour, yielding a different kind of loaf with a bit of extra nutrition. Such innovations might have been especially useful in years when grain was scarce, but legumes were plentiful. To accompany the bread, they also had a wide range of fruits and vegetables. From tablets, and archaeobotanical, that's a big word, archaeobotanical remains, we know that they had olives, grapes, figs, and pomegranates, Mediterranean staples that flourished in Anatolia's climate. They grew pulses like lentils, chickpeas, peas, and beans, which were crucial sources of nutrition. You could also put them into porridges and stews. Vegetables mentioned in records include cucumbers, leeks, onions, and garlic. A Hittite farmer's garden likely had leafy greens and herbs as well, though specifics are pretty scarce. One text refers to giant carrots, which might actually mean a type of thick parsnip or root. True orange carrots were a later development, by the way, but some root vegetables akin to carrots were present. These vegetables would be eaten in season to preserve them. Hittites could dry fruits like figs and grapes, making raisins, or store onions and garlic for months. Olives were pressed for their oil. Olive oil served for cooking, lamp fuel, and also ritual anointing. A pretty valuable commodity. Tablets list oil rations for workers or offerings to gods. Animal products rounded out the diet. The Hittites raised livestock such as cattle, goats, pigs, and sheep. From cows and goats they got milk, which they churned into butter, and likely made into cheese, though few specific descriptions of cheese survive. The ubiquity of dairying implies cheese or yogurt was a staple for storage of milk. Sheep and goats also provided meat, but meat was not an everyday fare for commoners. More often, animals were kept for their secondary products: wool, milk. Well, you'd only slaughter them occasionally for festivals, sacrifices, or if they got too old. Still, when meat was on the menu, it could be mutton, goat, beef, or pork, as well as any wild game. Hunting supplemented the diet. The forests were filled with deer, boar, and wild fowl. The Hittites enjoyed hunting, and their nobility organized hunts for sport, for example, chasing deer or lions with spears. Common folk might set simple traps for birds or rabbits. There's evidence that even fish from rivers and lakes were consumed, though fish is rarely mentioned in texts. The region's rivers had carp and trout, which could be caught regularly too. With these ingredients, grains, vegetables, dairy, and meat, Hittite cooking created simple but pretty nourishing dishes. And then there was another thing too: the spices and the flavorings. In Hittite cuisine they had coriander and cumin as two notable examples. And one other example, of course, is honey. That played a special role as a sweetener. Honey was abundant enough in Hatti that it was not an overtly expensive thing. Indeed, an Old Kingdom law notes that honey bread sold for the same price as a portion of butter or lard, indicating that honey was readily available. The Hittites were skilled beekeepers too, so much that they have the earliest known laws for beekeeping. One law sternly decrees that if anyone steals a beehive, in former times the punishment was to expose the thief to bee stings, but now the penalty is a fine. A colorful law, that's for sure. Wouldn't want to be on the end of that one. Not only a quirky old punishment, but, also a later reform to a monetary fine. Perhaps a little bit of social progress. Still, it's pretty consistent with the Hittite tendency to replace these capital punishment with more fines and gentler ways of correcting people's unlawful behavior. For drinks, the Hittites had several options. Water was the default, drawn from wells or springs, but it was often unsafe or unpalatable alone, so people turned to brewed beverages. And like many of their Mesopotamians, beer was chief among them. They'd brew this from barley and emmer wheat. But the beer wasn't like our normal beer in modern times. This was pretty thick, almost like a porridge, sometimes drunk with a pretty thick straw, perhaps lightly fermented, a nourished beverage that could even children could consume in a diluted form, and the alcohol content wasn't really enough to affect anybody unless you really drank the whole thing, but your stomach would usually get full before you felt that. And then there was wine, too. That was common especially in the later period, when the Hittites controlled vineyards in Syria and Anatolia's Mediterranean coast. The Hittite word for wine, wiana, even entered other languages. They made red wine from grapes and stored it in large pottery jars. The average villager might only taste wine on special occasions, whereas the palace and temple stored vast quantities of it for feasts. Now, interestingly, texts refer to something called beer wine, which, well, sounds like a bit of a mix between the two, or perhaps a stage of fermentation. Scholars aren't entirely sure what it was. It could have been a barley beer, brewed with a bit of grapes for flavor, or a term for mead or a cereal ale that had wine-like qualities. In any case, both beer and wine were beloved. A sober society the Hittites were not. Drinking to a bit of excess with wine was part of hospitality and ritual. There is evidence that they also drank milk, especially goat or sheep milk, and made it into yogurt-like drinks. For the more affluent, imported luxuries like oil of sesame for flavoring food or date syrup from Mesopotamia might be added to the pantry for a little bit of more exciting flavors. But you would tend to stick to the local stuff. Next, let's consider a few work occupations. Most Hittites, as we've seen, were farmers by necessity, but there were a few other occupations too. Let's start right at the top of that with the farmer. He, and often she as well, since women did labor in the fields, would rise at dawn. The cows need milking. The sheep need to be let out to graze early. Hittite farmers typically managed mixed farms, fields of grain or orchards plus herds of livestock. After the morning chores of feeding animals, a farmer might spend the day plowing if it's spring, weeding or irrigating in summer, harvesting in the late summer, or repairing tools or tending to vineyards in autumn. Seasonal rhythms dictated tasks: plow and sow by March, harvest by August, thresh by September. If he was fortunate to have hired help or slaves, those extra hands would join the work. In some cases, groups of farmers pooled labor. Well, they'd work in decent cooperation, much that is seen in a lot of traditional villages to this day. The Hittite farmer's toolkit included wooden plows, flint-bladed sickles, and axes for woodcutting. But he also had to be wary of pests, too. Birds descending on ripened grain, or locust swarms. That could be quite the onion in the ointment, as we say. In any case, it was a tough life, but a respected one. One text calls farmers the backbone of the realm. And well, that's still true to this modern day. Next we have the weaver. In Hittite society, weaving and textile production were predominantly women's work, but crucial to the economy. A Hittite weaver, perhaps a housewife with her daughters or a group of women in a palace workshop, would spend hours each day spinning fibers and working the loom. The main fibers were wool from sheep and linen from flax. Spindle whorls, that is small weights for a spinning thread, and loom weights for tension on upright looms, are among the most common artifacts you can find in Hittite ruins, showing just how ubiquitous this activity really was. A skilled weaver could produce fine cloth for garments or blankets, and maybe even more elaborate textiles for trade or temple offerings, things like that. Women might dye the yarn using natural dyes: madder root for red, indigo or woad for blue, onion skins or safflower for yellow, etc. Since texts do mention colored clothes, we know that they were doing this. In a typical day, a weaver could spin a few spools of thread and weave a few inches of fabric on a loom. Progress was pretty slow, so Large orders, say for a new tapestry or a tent, would take weeks or months. Some women weavers worked under palace supervision, turning out standardized textiles as a form of tax obligation or labor service, kind of like how you'd give away a portion of your crop as a tax. Yet even in a small village, a woman's woven cloth could be a trade item. Surplus textiles might be bartered for food or metal tools. Notably, weaving was considered the quintessential female craft, and even mythology shows us the Hittite goddess Hanahana, perhaps analogous to the mother goddess, associated with weaving. It gave women a sphere of economic power. They ran what were essentially small businesses from their homes. Hittite laws fixed the prices of certain quality textiles, so as not to cheat weavers or customers. The existence of price controls showed that textiles were significant commodities, and Hittite weavers were skilled enough to produce surplus for market. So next we have the scribe, and only a few could proudly wear that title. A scribe's daily work depended on whom he served. In the town administration, a scribe might sit in the local governor's office and record grain deliveries, write letters about tax collection or troop movements, even draft legal contracts. Scribes were also vital in temples, documenting ritual events and managing inventories of offerings. So imagine a scribe at a desk, which in those days likely meant a board on his lap or a floor, with a lump of fresh clay and a stylus, often a trimmed reed in hand. He's composing an official letter to a neighboring town, inscribing cuneiform signs line by line. Another tablet awaits him that might contain a marriage agreement or a court deposition that needs copying. The Hittite scribes wrote in several languages. They used Akkadian cuneiform for international letters, Hittite for domestic records, and even kept Sumerian logograms alive for certain religious or legal terms. This multilingual juggling was their expertise, but it was also quite a burden. The scribe's toolkit included clay tablets and a container of water to moisten the clay, as well as a wooden case, with waxed writing boards, for quick notes, or accounts, that is. Indeed, Hittites also wrote on wooden tablets coated with wax, which haven't survived, unfortunately, but we've got mentions of them in texts. These might have been used for ephemeral records or teaching, since they could be erased and reused. The life of a scribe could be relatively comfortable. They were literate, thus somewhat elite, and might receive rations from the state. But it was also a life of meticulous labor and sometimes tedium. As far as we know from a charming detail, scribes, after exchanging many letters, would sometimes scribble personal greetings to each other at the bottom of official correspondence, asking about each other's health, things like that. Kind of an ancient pen pal phenomenon. It does show that the scribes formed a community across distances, injecting moments of humanity into their clay documents. The best scribes could rise pretty high, too. For instance, the chief scribe at the capital oversaw the royal archives and was thus pretty close to the king. But even an ordinary scribe in a provincial town held status. Villagers would seek him out or to read or write on their behalf. Whether it be a contract for land or an omen for the gods, everything was important. And very luckily for us, we have the scribes to thank for much of our insights into Hittite culture. Next we have the artisan and merchant. Hittite Anatolia had a range of craftspeople: potters, metalworkers, carpenters, leatherworkers, etc. A potter would dig clay from riverbanks, refine it, and shape vessels on a simple turntable or wheel. And yes, the fast potter's wheel was known and used for finer wares. We found a few of them in archaeological digs. Then came the drying and firing of the pots in a kiln. Pottery found at Hittite sites range from plain cooking pots to beautifully burnished and painted ware. One common product was the pithos, a large storage jar which every household needed. So potters were never idle. There were always more orders coming in. Metal workers were also crucial. Bronze was the main metal, an alloy of copper and tin. It was used for weapons, tools, and jewelry. The Hittites are famous for early iron working as well, although in the Bronze Age iron was still rare and mostly for prestigious objects. In a workshop in Hattusa's lower city, a bronzesmith, might spend his day casting axe heads or forging a new sword for a noble. Small workshops likely dotted the city, seal engravers carving delicate designs onto stones, woodworkers building wagon wheels or furniture, things like that. And then there was trade, too. That was part of daily life. The goods had to go somewhere, right? Merchants organized caravans that carried goods between cities and beyond the kingdom's borders. The Hittites conducted commerce via barter and weighted metals. Silver was a common medium of exchange. Also, ingots or rings were used to measure it out. A merchant in Hittite Anatolia could deal in anything from textiles to copper ore. Caravans of donkeys and ox carts laden with goods trudged along the roads, stopping at way stations. One of the earlier chapters of Anatolian history, the Old Assyrian colony period, around about 19th century BCE, had seen Assyrian merchants living in Kanesh, trading tin and textiles for Anatolian silver. By the Hittite Empire period, those trade networks evolved, but continued. Hittites imported tin for bronze, luxury goods, and exported wine, olive oil. They all started flowing in, perhaps a few fine crafted items as well. So a day in the life of a Hittite trader might involve haggling in a market, supervising pack animals, and carefully recording debts on clay tablets. And indeed merchants could be literate, at least to a certain extent, practicalities concerned. Sometimes they'd hire scribes if they needed big jobs done. They might use metal weights, or coin-like chunks of silver by weight for transactions, since coinage was not quite around yet. Next up we have the soldier. Now, we gotta say with this that there wasn't really a permanent standing army in a modern sense, but there were professional corps troops and a feudal levy system. A Hittite soldier could be a commoner called up from his lands to fight for a season. If he was infantry, his daily life when not campaigning was similar to any farmer's. But when the campaign season was on, he trained and marched with his unit. If he was part of the chariot corps, well, he was an elite warrior, possibly from the noble class or specially trained. Training to be a charioteer involved learning to handle horses. There was a remarkable Hittite text by a horse trainer named Kikuli that details the 184-day training regimen for war horses. Indirectly, it also tells us about the rider's discipline. On a campaign, a soldier's day might start before dawn, packing gear, and marching off with bow, spear, or sword in hand. When not active in war, soldiers participated in royal hunts, or served as laborers on building projects. The Hittites placed great emphasis on order and obedience in their military ranks. One tablet of instructions to the royal bodyguard, for example, specifies their duties at night, likely to patrol and keep watch in shifts. Off the battlefield, the warrior's life included guarding border garrisons, perhaps escorting caravans to protect against bandits. It was a duty to the state that many took pride in. Hittite rulers praised loyal soldiers in records. But there was also a spiritual aspect. Before battle, soldiers partook in rituals to secure the gods' favor. And after the battle, they observed the purification, if exposed to bloodshed. That is, Hittites were very concerned about ritual purity. Thus, a soldier's daily regimen blended the physical and the ritual together. And next is a rather unique one, just to finish off this section. The wise woman, or the old woman, Munusugugi in Hittite tablets as they call it, who was essentially a professional ritual practitioner and healer. Now, despite the name, she didn't have to be elderly. It was a title for a woman skilled in magic and divination. Her day might be called into action when a household had a misfortune, or when someone fell ill in a way thought to be caused by a curse or an evil spell. An old woman would arrive with a kit of ritual paraphernalia, maybe figurines, knotted cords, herbs, and sacrificial animals. She would perform ceremonies. For example, to cure a sick child, she might cut symbolic strings, recite incantations, and transfer the illness into a surrogate object, like a wax figure or a sacrificed animal. If a family was haunted by bad luck, she could conduct a ritual to banish witchcraft, which might involve burning certain, ingredients or hiding protective amulets around the house, this kind of thing. Old women also played major roles in state rituals. They were present at royal funerals and oaths, and kings consulted them for oracles. It is recorded that these old women could, quote, lift the spell from a bewitched army, or ensure that a plague would end by appeasing the gods. Thus, while on an average day, an old woman might be helping quarreling spouses with a domestic charm, on another day she could be leading a purification ritual for the king himself. These women had high status. They were learned in traditions, often literate in ritual texts, and highly respected. Essentially, they formed a guild of female clergy alongside the male priests. A day in their life was far removed from field labor. It was more about mental and spiritual labor. They fasted, they prayed, and they prepared elaborate rites. It just goes to show how work in Hittite society wasn't all manual or commercial. There were other spiritual concerns. Well, I think from these snapshots, we can see that Hittite occupations were quite diverse. Now, but one other interesting aspect is the use of forced or corvée labor for state projects. Hittite kings would draft the villagers to help build fortifications or roads. For example, constructing the great walls of Hattusa or digging ditches required thousands of hands. Tax records show that communities were expected to send a certain number of laborers periodically. While this was a burden on daily life, it was normalized as part of the duty to the crown. And in exchange, everyone would get fed, so you give a little, you get a little. Alright, just before we go, let's talk a bit more about Hittite religion. We'll do a full video on it, but we can't really go past daily life without that. It's kind of a big deal. Now, the Hittites famously called their land the realm of 1,000 gods. It's kind of going to give you a bit of a hint as to whether or not they were polytheistic. Religion pervaded every aspect of life, not in a separate and pious compartment, but really woven into everyday routines, seasonal activities, and state affairs. To a Hittite, the natural world was alive with divinity. Every river, mountain, forest, and even every household hearth had a spirit or minor god, and they all deserved respect. At the popular level, the Hittites maintained household shrines, or at least sacred objects at home. Excavations in domestic areas have found small clay idols and libation vessels, which were likely used in private worship. A typical family might have a figurine of the storm god, since he was the one who brought the rain for the crops, or the sun goddess, perhaps an ancestral god also called the gods of the father or the mother. These would be honored with small offerings, a bit of beer poured out, a piece of bread, especially at mealtimes or on special occasions. the passage of a loved one from sickness to health, or the birth of a child, or even the completion of a house might prompt a family to sacrifice a small animal like a chicken or a pigeon in thanks, though the text more often mentioned larger state sacrifices. It's logical that in villages minor sacrifices happened too. And then there were dreams. You see, dreams were taken quite seriously. If you had a troubling dream, you might seek a ritual to avert whatever ill it portended. Might go back to that old woman we talked about, Pretty good job for her. Well, conversely, a good dream could be a direct message from the gods, and that's all good news. There's no need to panic in that case. Public worship centered on temples and festivals. Every city and town had temples. Hattusa boasted over 30 of them at its peak, including the huge temple of the storm god in the lower city. These temples were not just religious centers, but also hubs for economic matters. They were the ones who stored the grain and the oil, but they also employed the scribes, the musicians, the craftsmen, and, of course, the priests. Now, speaking of priests, a priest's daily life in a temple involved numerous rituals: morning and evening libations to the deity, care for a cult statue, and tending the sacred fire and oil lamps. Hittite religion was very ritualistic. They believed that properly performed rituals maintained cosmic order and the favor of the gods. There was improperly ones, well, you know what that's like. For example, each day at the temple of the storm god, priests would pour out libations of beer and wine, present bread and meat on the altar, and recite hymns or prayers written on clay tablets. The gods were thought to consume the essence of these offerings, after which the priests and temple staff often got to eat the remaining food. So the temple doubled as kind of a communal kitchen, I suppose, especially during big festivals. Now, what about the pantheon? Well, that was a rich tapestry of Hittite, Hurrian, Hattian, and even Mesopotamian deities. The chief deity was traditionally the storm god of Hatti and his consort, the sun goddess of Arina. But there were literally hundreds more. Gods of the underworld, agricultural gods, war gods, love goddesses, tutelary deities of gates, mountains. You name it, they had it. A common person probably didn't worship all 1,000 individually. Time would not permit it. They would focus on a few local and personal patron deities. For instance, a farmer might be particularly devoted to Telepinu, a god of farming and fertility, praying to him for good crops. A soldier might favor the storm god of battle, for victory in war. That was a Teshub or Tarunt. Mothers revered Hanahana, when we had mentioned the mother goddess for protection of children, and so forth. But religion was not exclusive. The same person might make an offering to a river god before a journey, and then sacrifice to a household god at home, and also attend the city festival for the storm god. The Hittites were remarkably inclusive, even syncretistic. They identified foreign gods with their own and often adopted new gods from other cultures, earning them that moniker of the people of 1,000 gods. Well, next up we got festivals. They were quite the highlight of the religious calendar, and indeed, the highlight of the year for most citizens. The Hittite calendar had numerous festival days. Texts refer to 165 festivals in a year. Some big, most kind of small. Some were local village festivals. Others were empire-wide. Among the grandest were these spring festivals, one called Antasum, possibly the Crocus or Spring Festival, and the Puruli Festival, to celebrate spring's triumph over winter. In the fall, they had a harvest or festival of haste, which they likely gave thanks for the crops. And there was a gatehouse festival in autumn as well, whose details are obscure, but might have marked the year's end or purification of the city gates. During these major festivals, normal work stopped or was reduced. People prepared special foods. The gold statues of gods were paraded outside their temples in lavish processions. For example, during a storm god festival, the statue of the deity, a golden or wooden idol, would be taken out on a chariot, accompanied by priests, musicians playing lyres and drums, and perhaps dancers in costume. The whole community gathered to watch and participate. Great feasts were held. Oxen, sheep, and goats were sacrificed in numbers, and everyone got to eat a little bit of protein. Barrels of beer and wine were opened freely. The texts mentioned music, dance, and even sports contests at these festivals. One can imagine a lively scene, youths competing in foot races or wrestling matches to entertain the crowd and honor the gods, while families picnic on the grassy fields outside the city. For many commoners, the festivals were not only sacred events, but rare opportunities for leisure and celebration. And finally, magic and divination. They were another part of daily life. When confronted with uncertainty, the Hittites turned to oracular methods. They had professional augurs and diviners who could read omens from the flight of birds or the entrails of sacred animals. A clay liver model found in Hattusa shows how priests would inspect a sheep's liver for odd marks, interpreting them as messages from the gods. For commoners, perhaps a simpler form of divination was used, tossing bread or observing the behavior of sacred birds kept at temples. The outcome of such divinations could directly affect the daily plans, i.e. someone would say, well, the omens say it's unlucky to plant today, so I suppose we'll just wait until tomorrow. It's a very interesting way of getting yourself out of work for the day, isn't it? Well, the Hittite belief in dreams as omens we mentioned meant that if a person had a vivid or disturbing one, they might go to a temple and report it to get a priest's interpretation. In some recorded cases, kings had dreams that they thought were communications from gods and adjusted their policies accordingly. We can be sure villagers likewise paid heed to such things, attributing a nightmare perhaps to an angry ancestor or a god requiring just that little bit more attention. In any case, I think that's all we're going to talk about today for daily life in Hittite Anatolia. So what do you think? Would you like to be a Hittite? Over 3,000 years ago, massive stone lions stood guard in silence. They flanked the entrance to a city that was once lost to history. This is Hattusa, the ancient capital of the Hittite Empire, a late Bronze Age superpower that rivaled New Kingdom Egypt and Assyria. Hattusa's tale is one of dramatic reversals. It was a city cursed and burned to the ground, yet reborn to imperial glory. A fortress that witnessed grand treaties and devastating plagues, and a royal seat that vanished so completely that later ages forgot it existed. Hattusa reached its height in the late Bronze Age, contemporary with Egypt's pharaohs and the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece. Yet unlike those cultures, the Hittite capital vanished from memory, until modern archaeology unveiled its secrets. Situated amid the rocky hills of central Anatolia, Hattusa occupied a strategic position overlooking a fertile plain within the great loop of the Halys River. Today, you can find the ruins in modern-day Turkey, near the town of Bogaskale. Their tumbled fortifications and temple foundations attest to a once advanced urban center. It has quite a story behind it, a fascinating history of a dead kingdom. And I think the story of Hattusa offers a pretty good window into the world of the Hittites and the rather turbulent international arena of the late Bronze Age. So, let's take a visit to the old capital, shall we? allow me to welcome you before we set off on our journey. I am your host for this evening, or this morning, this afternoon, whenever you're listening, and wherever you're listening from. Perhaps you can tell me, where are you listening from? Now, one thing you don't have to worry about here is the ads that plague the rest of the videos on this platform. We've turned them all off because we hate them as much as you do. The reason we can do this is because we are quite generously supported by our Patreon members, also the YouTube members, the merch store visitors, and the donation givers. If you want to become part of that esteemed team, then navigate yourself to the pinned comment and video description. But if you don't really care about that, that's fine. Everything sucks at the moment, so you should probably save your money. Just enjoy the video while you're here. That's the point. Well, speaking of the video, let's get to it, shall we? And let's start from the earliest times. The recorded history of Hattusa doesn't begin in triumph, nor does it begin in some great grand myth, but rather it begins in destruction. In the 18th century BCE, the city was devastated by a warlord from a rival Anatolian kingdom. King Anita of Kusara led his forces against Hattusa. He captured it, he burned it, and then he left a stark warning for posterity. According to the ancient inscription attributed to Anita, he razed Hattusa and cursed anyone who dared rebuild it. Quote, "Whoever becomes king after me and settles Hattusa again, may the storm god of heaven strike him down." Well, this curse, carved into a clay tablet around 1700 BCE, was meant to condemn the site to eternal desolation. Certainly didn't do much for the real estate values. I mean, for a time it seemed to be effective. Hattusa lay in ashes and ruin, a dead outpost, avoided by any would-be rulers. But as we shall see, history had other plans. In a twist of irony, the abandoned site of Hattusa would soon give its name to a rising dynasty. Sometime around 1650 BCE, a Hittite ruler from elsewhere in Anatolia decided to defy Anita's curse. This king, known originally as Labarna, moved his capital to the ruins and rebuilt the city himself. In an act of symbolic rebirth, he even assumed the name Hattusili, meaning the man of Hattusa, proclaiming himself forever linked to this resurrected stronghold. Hattusili I refortified Hattusa's heights and established it as the political center of what would become the Old Hittite Kingdom. From his citadel atop the rocky Acropolis, also called Buyakale, the Great Fortress, Hattusili I led military campaigns that expanded Hittite influence over central Anatolia and into northern Syria. The choice of Hattusa as capital proved to be quite a wise one. You see, the site's natural defenses included steep hillsides, abundant forests, and reliable water sources that could sustain a city under siege. It didn't do too well the first time, but hey, maybe second or third time lucky. With Hattusili's reign, the cursed city became the beating heart of a new Anatolian empire. But despite its renewed stature, the early years of Hattusa were anything but peaceful. No time for celebrating. Intrigue and violence stalked the halls of the royal palace. Hittite chronicles tell us that Hattusili's heir, Mursili I, continued the kingdom's expansion to quite a spectacular scale, most famously sacking the distant Babylon in 1595. Quite an achievement, an event that echoed across the Near East. However, upon returning to Hattusa after this triumph, Mursili I met a bloody end. He was assassinated in his own palace, apparently as part of a coup led by his brother-in-law Hantili. This regicide plunged the kingdom into turmoil, as one murder led to another in the royal succession, a grim pattern recorded later in the Edict of Telepinu. Speaking of Telepinu, a mid-century Hittite king, he lamented the cycle of killings that plagued the royal family after Mursili's death. Hard to get anything done with that many leadership changes. These records give a rare glimpse into the turbulence within the court of Hattusa. Ambitious princes and generals vying for power, sometimes through treachery, sometimes assassination. Telepinu seized the throne amid this chaos and attempted to halt the bloodshed by codifying rules of succession. In his edict, he decreed that the crown must pass to the next legitimate heir, and established the Pangus, a council of nobles, as guardians of justice. This was an early constitutional effort to bring order to Hittite governance and prevent further palace intrigue. The fact that Telepinu's proclamation survived on a clay tablet in Hattusa's archives underscores the city's role not only as a military command center, but also as an administrative and legal hub for the kingdom. So, by the 14th century BCE, Hattusa had firmly established itself as one of the great capitals of the ancient world, fitting in with Babylon and Uruk, all the other ones. This period, often called the Hittite New Kingdom, or the Empire period, saw Hatti, as the Hittites referred to their realm, rise to become a superpower alongside Egypt, Assyria, and Mycenaean Greece. From Hattusa, the kings of the Hittites corresponded with pharaohs and Mesopotamian monarchs. In one letter found on a tablet, a Hittite great king addresses the king of Babylon as, quote, "my brother," exchanging gifts and diplomatic courtesies. The rulers of Hattusa engaged in both diplomacy and war as they governed an empire that spanned most of Anatolia and large parts of northern Syria. Hattusa's importance on the international stage is demonstrated by the archives of clay tablets discovered in its ruins, much of which include treaties, letters, and decrees exchanged with contemporary great kings. But one of the most celebrated documents found at Hattusa is the Treaty of Kadesh. It's often hailed as the world's earliest recorded peace treaty. Inscribed on cuneiform tablets in Akkadian, which was, the diplomatic lingua franca of the time, this treaty was concluded around 1259 between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II. It brought an end to decades of conflict between the two empires following the indecisive Battle of Kadesh, an epic chariot engagement that neither side won outright, despite the way that Ramesses tried to spin it for propaganda purposes. If anything, it was a Pyrrhic victory, but hey, don't let the truth get in the way of a good story, right? In any case, in this pact, both rulers swore to maintain peace and brotherhood between their realms in perpetuity. Sounds like a good plan. Let's see if it works out. So we can imagine the ceremony in Hattusa's audience hall when this accord was ratified, the Hittite scribes reciting their terms, officials witnessing as a silver tablet of the treaty was presented, and then there's the prayers offered to 100 gods to uphold the new peace. Notably, the treaty was ratified by both sides as equals, and even bore the co-signature of Hattusili's formidable wife, Queen Puduhepa, showing the influential role of Hittite royal women too. The treaty's text proclaims that the lands of Egypt and Hatti, to remember that's what they called their empire, shall be at peace forever, and that the children and grandchildren of both rulers will remain in brotherhood. And indeed, about a decade later, the peace was sealed with a marriage alliance. A Hittite princess, Hattusili's own daughter, traveled from Hattusa to Egypt to marry Ramesses II. The joyous celebrations of that wedding, recorded in Egyptian inscriptions, symbolize the new era of fraternity between the former rivals. Now, There is a copy, too, of the Hittite-Egyptian treaty that hangs on the wall of the United Nations in New York, a testament to the legacy in diplomatic history. At its imperial zenith, Hattusa was not only a political capital, but also a cosmopolitan hub of Bronze Age culture and international exchange. Foreign emissaries from Babylon, Assyria, Arzawa, and beyond traveled to the gates of Hattusa. Hittite kings addressed their peers in Egypt or Babylon as brother, reflecting a sense of parity and equality among great powers. The city's scribes were adept in multiple languages and scripts. They wrote mainly in Hittite, the official language, but also maintained archives in Akkadian and Hurrian. In Hattusa's royal correspondence, we find mention of lands as far away as the Aegean. The Hittites referred to a distant great king, Ahiyawa, most likely the Mycenaean Greek world, and even to a city called Wilusa, which many identify with the legendary Troy. Such records suggest that Hattusa's scribes preserved, a distant echo of events on the fringes of the Greek world. And we also see requests for gold, skilled artisans, and royal daughters in marriage. Hallmarks of the complex diplomacy of the age. Something we haven't really shook off until modern times, to be honest. One extraordinary episode connecting Hattusa to international events was the so-called Zananza affair. An Egyptian queen, widely believed to be the widow of Tutankhamun, wrote to the Hittite court requesting a prince as a husband. King Suppiluliuma I, the brilliant warrior king who reigned from Hattusa around 1344 to 1322, cautiously agreed, and he sent one of his sons, Prince Zananza, to Egypt. But the problem was, Zananza did not arrive safely. He was actually murdered on the road. Well, bad news, of course. Suppiluliuma's outrage at this treachery led to a new war with Egypt. Peace treaties be damned. And Hittite soldiers returning from those battles unwittingly brought back a devastating plague that would ravage Hattusa for years. We know of this tragedy from the poignant plague prayers of King Mursili II, who succeeded Suppiluliuma I. In these prayers, preserved on clay tablets in Hattusa's archives, Mursili beseeches the gods to lift a plague that has made the land of Hatti desolate, confessing sins and desperately seeking the divine cause of the calamity. Such texts provide an intimate human voice from the ancient city, don't you think? A king's anguish as he has to watch his people suffer and die, all recorded in cuneiform and laid to rest in Hattusa's libraries, for us thousands of years later to enjoy. But what exactly was Hattusa like in its heyday? Well, archaeology and textual records together paint a picture of a grand city, quite different in character from the river valley metropolises of Egypt or Mesopotamia. A traveller approaching Hattusa around 1250 would first behold its formidable stone walls crowning the hills. Entering through an outer gate flanked by the roaring stone lions, the traveller would be enveloped by the sounds and smells of a thriving city. The streets of the lower town bustled with merchants hawking wares, workers hauling sacks of grain to granaries, and children darting between the mud-brick homes. And over it rose the towering facade of the great temple, reminding everyone of the storm god's presence. Hattusa was divided into a lower city in the north and an upper city in the south, separated by craggy terrain and massive fortification walls. The lower city contained the oldest and most vital landmark of Hattusa, the great temple, the huge religious complex dedicated to the storm god of Hatti and the sun goddess of Arinna, the chief deities of the Hittite pantheon. The great temple's stone foundations and paved courtyards can still actually be seen today. It was surrounded by storerooms that once held grain, oil, and precious cult provisions, emphasizing its central role in both worship and the state economy. Now, nearby to all of this, in the lower city, lay dense residential quarters and workshops. Though little remains of the ordinary houses, they were built of timber and mud brick, materials that have long since eroded away. Archaeologists have found their stone footings, and even the floor plans. And so with that, we can imagine the narrow lanes lined with two-story homes of plastered brick, each one of them with an inner courtyard. The population of Hattusa at its height is kinda hard to determine, but modern estimates suggest around 10,000. Now, that is far smaller than the contemporaneous Thebes or Babylon, but it's still quite impressive. Older estimates did guess at 40 to 50,000, but the city's remote location and limited agricultural hinterland likely kept the population lower, perhaps in the tens of thousands at most if we're taking the most generous interpretation, but this is not a competition about population size. Now, outside Hattusa's walls, farmers in surrounding villages grew barley and wheat, and tended herds of sheep and cattle to feed the city, while within the walls, specialized craftsmen produced pottery, textiles, and metal goods, under the watchful eye of the administration. Notably, the Hittites were early experimenters with iron working. Iron was still rare and mostly ceremonial in this period, but iron blades from Hattusa were prized gifts exchanged between great kings. This technological edge, subtle at the time, foreshadowed the coming Iron Age, in which Anatolia would play a key role. Ascending into the upper city, one would enter a newer ceremonial and administrative district, largely developed during the later Hittite Empire. Hattusili III, and especially his son, Tudalia IV, late 13th century that is, undertook ambitious building projects that transformed Hattusa's skyline. They extended the city's fortifications to enclose a much larger area to the south, and built a series of monumental gateways decorated with stone reliefs. The most famous of these are the Lion Gate and the King's Gate on the southern circuit of the walls, and the Sphinx Gate on the high eastern rampart. The Lion Gate features two carved lions, mouth open in a perpetual roar, standing guard at the threshold. The King's Gate is adorned with a relief figure, often thought to represent a warrior god rather than a specific ruler. He wears a horned helmet. At the Sphinx Gate, a pair of imposing sphinx statues stood central. This gate was perched atop a high artificial bastion known today as Yerkapi. The rampart's long sloping slides were carefully stone-paved, and an arched tunnel runs underneath, perhaps a postern passage for troops or processional entryway, showcasing the Hittites' skill in engineering and defensive design. Pretty impressive for the time. Archaeologists discovered the two sculpted sphinxes buried near the gate. One sphinx was eventually restored and returned to Turkey from a German museum, reuniting it with its twin at the site after nearly a century. These grand gateways served practical defensive purposes, but also proclaimed Hittite royal ideology to all who entered. Each gate was a ceremonial passage, through which foreign dignitaries and Hittite subjects alike would pass during festivals or royal audiences, greeted by the images of lions, kings, and protective deities. Behind the imposing walls of the upper city stretched a sacred and administrative landscape. Hattusa was sometimes called the City of 1,000 Gods. Why? Well, because the Hittites had readily incorporated deities from every land that they absorbed. Tudalia IV's expansion included the construction of some 30 temples in the upper city, each devoted to different gods of the Hittite, Hurrian, or regional pantheons. Though none matched the sheer scale of the great temple in the lower city, that is. Collectively, these sanctuaries signaled Hattusa's statues as a religious center for the entire empire at large. The most striking religious monument associated with Hattusa lies just outside the city walls at a place called Yazilikaya, an open-air sanctuary of natural rock. There, in 2 rock chambers, Tudalia IV ordered elaborate reliefs of dozens of gods and goddesses be carved into the stone, creating a grand tableau of the divine assembly. The walls of these chambers show procession upon procession of deities, the 12 gods of the underworld, the mighty storm god Teshub, and his consort the sun goddess, and even the likeness of Tudalia IV himself in divine attire. During the great annual festivals, such as the Spring New Year Festival, Hittite priests and the royal family led processions from Hattusa to Yazilikaya, conducting ceremonies under the sky in that dramatic rock setting. The existence of Yazilikaya, so near to Hattusa, shows that the capital was not only a political seat, but also a spiritual one, where state religion was centered and the king served as a chief priest of the realm. Overlooking the entire city was the royal acropolis on Buyukale, the great fortress where the palaces and administrative offices of the great Hittite king were built. This high citadel was the nerve center of imperial power. It held audience halls where the great king of Hatti would receive envoys bearing gifts and letters from across the known world. Here, treaty oaths were sworn, and vassal princes paid homage to their overlord. Tablets found in the archives describe annual feasts at which vassal rulers from subject lands gathered in Hattusa to reaffirm their loyalty, likely bringing lavish tribute to the Hittite court. At least they better. Don't want to show up empty-handed. The Hittites maintained their rule over far-flung territories through a web of such vassal treaties, showing a pragmatic tolerance. They generally allowed local kings to continue ruling and local gods to remain venerated. All they wanted was yearly tribute and obedience. This relatively federative approach helped hold a diverse empire together under Hattusa's leadership. Life in the place could be luxurious, but also austere by Near Eastern standards, unlike the mud-brick ziggurats of Mesopotamia or the stone temples of Thebes. Hittite architecture favored timber and mud brick atop stone foundations, and most buildings were 1 or 2 stories high. The Anatolian climate necessitated thick walls and hearths for cold winters. Excavations have uncovered fragments of vibrant wall paintings and colored ceramics that hint at the interior decoration of palaces and temples. A famous artifact is the Hattusa greenstone, a polished, throne-sized monolith of unknown origin or purpose, found in the prominent plaza of the upper city. Now, some think that it was an altar, or perhaps used in purification rituals. But it remains a bit of a mystery. Still, it's probably something to do with a religious ritual. Anyway, most of them are. Now, of particular importance in Hattusa were its archives and scribal quarters. The city's bureaucracy kept meticulous records on clay tablets, many of which were preserved by being baked. Now, this was either intentionally done in ovens or accidentally in destructive fires. Tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets have been recovered from Hattusa's ruins, constituting a veritable library of Hittite civilization. Now, how cool is that? In these tablets, we find legal codes that detail everything from the price of a slave, from the penalty for stealing a sheep. Notably, Hittite law was, for the time, relatively humane. Many offenses were punished by fines or compensation rather than death, revealing a rather pragmatic approach to justice. These law tablets, along with royal edicts standardizing weights and measures, diplomatic letters full of courtesies and threats, were filed carefully on wooden shelves in the palatial archives. We also find literature and mythology, Hittite versions of Mesopotamian epics like the Epic of Gilgamesh, as well as indigenous Hittite myths such as the tale of the dragon-slaying storm god and the adventures of Telepinu, a fertility god whose disappearance causes all life on Earth to wither until he is found again. It's texts like this that revealed that Hattusa was an intellectual center where foreign influences mingled with local tradition. Scribes even compiled multilingual glossaries and dictionaries, showing off their scholarly mastery of Sumerian and the Akkadian tongue alongside their native Hittite. To be a scribe in Hattusa was to have the world's knowledge at one's fingertips, and the archives suggest a proud awareness among the Hittite elite that their capital's records would preserve their civilization's legacy. Everyday life for Hattusa's inhabitants, be they artisans, soldiers, priests, or officials, unfolded in the shadow of the city's great walls and temples. Festivals were frequent, and they must have been pretty damn spectacular. During the spring festival of Puruli, for example, priests carried the idols of the storm god in procession through Hattusa's streets, and out of the rock shrine of the Yazilikaya, accompanied by musicians and ecstatic dancers reenacting the myth of the storm god's triumph over the dragon Illuyanka. Common citizens likely lined the streets to watch these holy pageants, witnessing their king and queen officiate the ceremonies that renewed the land's fertility each year. Such ceremonies reinforced the sacred aura of kingship. The ruling couple participated as intermediaries between the gods and people, legitimizing their power through piety. Meanwhile, Hattusa's strategic location meant that the sounds of war and preparation were never far away. The city housed armories and workshops for chariots and weapons, and its garrison of troops kept watch on the frontiers. Hittite texts refer to the king's standing army and elite warriors. It is likely that contingents of soldiers were stationed in or near the capital, drilling on its parade grounds and manning the thick ramparts whenever a threat loomed. In the markets of the lower city, merchants traded products from across the realm. Copper and tin, vital for making bronze, arrived via a long-distance trade. Wine and olive oil came from the coastal regions, while local farmers brought in flax, wool, and salt. You might have seen Babylonian or Canaanite traders in the streets alongside the Hurrian musicians, or even the Luwian-speaking farmers from the nearby villages. While simpler and more rustic in appearance than the opulent cities of Egypt or Mesopotamia, the streets of Hattusa likely had their own lively bustle and refinement, all enriched by a mix of peoples, Hittite, Hattian, Luwian, Hurrian, and others. They all called the empire home, and through it all, the figure of the great king persisted, often distant in his fortified citadel, yet present in the lives of his subjects through his laws, taxes, and the awe that his very title commanded. Hattusa embodied the Hittite state in microcosm, resilient, diverse, and bound together by loyalty to the throne and the god of the storms. Hattusa's dominance was periodically challenged by both foreign enemies and internal problems. One of the city's great trials came in the early 14th century, during the reign of a king known later as Tudalia III. The Hittite realm was beset by invasions on multiple fronts. Tribes from the north, the Kaska people from the Pontic Mountains, launched raids deep into Hittite territory, while enemies from Arzawa in the west and Isua, east of the Euphrates, pressed in from other directions. In a series of calamities, these foes even managed to attack and sack Hattusa itself. The devastation was so complete that a foreign observer, Pharaoh Amenhotep III of Egypt, was informed that, quote, "the land of Hatti is finished." Indeed, for a brief period, the Hittite capital certainly seemed that way. It was abandoned, its people dispersed to safer areas. The king and court fled to another city, perhaps Samoa in the east, according to the later Hittite records, that is, to regroup and plan their counter-offensive. But the thing is, the Hittites were far from finished. Under the leadership of Tudalia's son, the future Suppiluliuma I, by the way, the kingdom staged a stunning recovery. Suppiluliuma proved to be a military genius, as well as a savvy statesman. Through a series of brilliant campaigns, he reconquered all the lost territories. And he didn't stop there. He even expanded Hittite dominion further than before, into the regions of Syria previously under Mitannian or Egyptian influence. Hattusa was liberated and rebuilt, rising from its ashes like a phoenix, or something like that. The Egyptian pharaoh's premature declaration of Hati's end was thus dramatically overturned. Better luck next time. According to the Hittite chronicles, Tudalia III eventually returned from exile, and with his son Suppiluliuma, they made the land of Hatti again whole. By the end of Suppiluliuma's conquests, Hattusa was more secure and more powerful than ever, presiding over an empire that now truly rivaled the might of Egypt and Assyria. The city's fortunes continued to ebb and flow with the Hittite geopolitical strategy. Early in the 13th century, King Muwatalli II made the extraordinary decision to relocate the royal seat, away from Hattusa. Not a very popular decision, it seems. He established a new capital at Tarhuntassa, a city in the warmer southern part of the realm, perhaps in Anatolia's plains near Cilicia. The reasons for this move remain partly conjectural. Muwatalli may have wanted to position himself closer to the impending theatre of conflict with Egypt in Syria, or perhaps just to distance the court from the troublesome northern frontier where the Kaskans were always causing a nuisance for the Hittites. In any case, they were not good neighbors. During Muwatalli's reign, which included the Battle of Kadesh against Ramesses II, Hattusa was temporarily relegated from primary capital to secondary city under the governorship of Muwatalli's younger brother, Hattusili, the future Hattusili III. The population and political activity in Hattusa likely declined during those years around 1270, and some temples may have seen fewer ceremonies as the court and cult focus shifted south. The situation, however, was short-lived. You see, after Muwatalli's death, his son, Urhi-Teshub, who took the royal name Mursili III, inherited the throne and initially maintained Tarhuntassa as his seat. But Hattusili, the king's uncle who had held power in Hattusa, rebelled against his nephew. In a dramatic civil conflict, Hattusili deposed Urhi-Teshub and seized the throne for himself, becoming King Hattusili III. And one of his first acts, guess what, was to restore Hattusa as the permanent capital of the empire. Back to the good old days. The court and primary deities returned to Hattusa, and Tarhuntassa was likely demoted to a regional center governed by a vassal. Hattusili III's reign thus marked a renaissance for the old capital. He and his successors poured resources into rebuilding and beautifying Hattusa on a grand scale, perhaps both to reassert the city's supremacy, but also to stamp their own legacy on its story. In any case, Hattusa was well and truly back in business. The final major phase of construction at Hattusa took place under Tudalia IV, who lived around 1237 to 1209. He was the son of Hattusili III, by the way. Tudalia IV undertook what might be called an ancient urban renewal program. He strengthened Hattusa's defenses, refurbished older walls and towers, and added secondary ramparts in key areas. He basically created a double-line fortification around much of the upper city. He commissioned the carving of monumental inscriptions in Luwian hieroglyphs, the indigenous Anatolian scripts on cliff faces and gate jambs, boldly proclaiming his building works and the favor of the gods. And, as described earlier, he oversaw the construction of numerous new temples and ceremonial structures, turning the upper city into a veritable temple district. Visitors to Hattusa and to Dalia IV's time would have seen a city humming with construction, crews hauling limestone blocks for new sanctuaries, sculptors chiseling reliefs of lions and sphinxes at the gateways, and priests consecrating one temple after the other. But it's a little bit ironic, because this era of urban splendor came exactly when the twilight of the Hittite kingdom was about to begin. Even as Tudalia built impressively, external pressures on the empire were mounting. It wasn't just for the Hittites either. The entire known world was about to fall to pieces. But for a brief period, Hattusa could truly boast of being one of the most splendid cities of the Near East, filled with statues of gods, gleaming temple facades, and massive fortifications, ones that overawed all that beheld them. So around 1200, calamity struck Hattusa and the Hittite Empire. As with many Bronze Age civilizations, the precise cause of the Hittite collapse remains a subject of study and debate. I did a video about it a little while ago. Perhaps you want to look at the Bronze Age collapse video. I have a few opinions of my own. Nothing too out there. Don't want to get controversial on you. Well, what is clear is that Hattusa did not escape the turmoil that swept across the Near East at the end of the 13th century. The last known Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, left inscriptions indicating that he fought hard to defend the realm. One text boasts of a naval victory against attackers from Alashia, which is believed to be Cyprus. But even this capable monarch could not stem the tide of collapse. The Hittite capital was ultimately destroyed, and it was completely abandoned, marking an abrupt end to its roughly 5 centuries of importance. Archaeological evidence suggests that Hattusa's fall was not a single cataclysmic event, but a process that unfolded over several years. Signs of fire and devastation are found in the final occupation layer. But there are also indications that long before the final burning, the city's population had begun to dwindle. Many valuables and portable objects were removed from the temples and palaces, and crucial state archives were deliberately emptied or hidden away. But here's something tantalizing. Historians do still wonder if some royal records were spirited off to a different location, yet to be found. Now that's the fascinating part. This is why I do archaeological review every month. Maybe one month we'll find those records. Well, all of this suggests that the Hittite elite saw the end coming, and they evacuated in an orderly manner, possibly fleeing to safer regions or seeking refuge with the allied kingdoms. In any case, by the time the hostile forces arrived to deliver the final blow, Hattusa might have already been a veritable ghost town, left hollowed out, with only a skeleton crew or no inhabitants at all. Who ultimately burned Hattusa is not definitely known. Some scholars point to the Kashgans, those northern tribes, likely culprits since they'd harried Hati's northern borders for centuries and would have seized upon a weakened, near-empty city. Others consider the general upheavals of the era, the so-called Sea People migrations and raids that affected the eastern Mediterranean around 1200, or even internal revolts and uprisings. Climate change might have played a role too. Evidence from the paleoclimate studies hints at a regional drought in the late 13th century, which could have led to crop failures, famine, and a social breakdown, exacerbating the vulnerability of the empire. But in any case, by around 1180, give or take a few decades, the great capital lay in ruin. The collapse of the Hittite state was so complete that no new empire rose in central Anatolia to claim their legacy. The site remained largely deserted, apart from a small fortress or village established centuries later by the Phrygians, early Iron Age people, or other newcomers. And indeed, archaeologists have found traces of Phrygian pottery and defensive walls on the hill dating to around the 8th century BCE, a faint postscript and epilogue to the story of Hattusa. Meanwhile, in the lands to the south, a few Neo-Hittite successor kingdoms such as Carchemish and Melid lingered on, keeping some Hittite cultural traditions alive for a time. These small principalities, ruled by descendants of the Hittite royalty, preserved the Luwian hieroglyphic writing and some aspects of the Hittite art into the Iron Age. But Hattusa itself faded from memory. Within a few generations, no one in the Near East remembered that a mighty empire had once ruled from that wind-swept citadel. Well, the Greeks who later traveled through Anatolia had no idea that the overgrown mounds near Bogaskale concealed a royal city. Herodotus and other classical writers made only vague references to ancient Syrian or Anatolian kingdoms in the area. They never knew that they were passing right over the tomb of an empire. And so, for 2,000 years, Hattusa slept, known only as a set of ruins and local legends. Its very name was forgotten. The world's knowledge of the Hittites vanished so completely that by the 19th century, the Hittites were little more than obscure figures, mentioned in the Bible, and a few ancient Egyptian inscriptions. The resurrection of Hattusa began with curious travelers and scholars. It was in the year 1834 that the French archaeologist Charles Texier visited Bogaskoy, the local name for the area, and was astonished to find massive stone ruins. He mapped walls, gateways, and strange relief carvings of warriors on rocks. Texier published his findings, igniting European interest in the ruins of Bogoskoy. Over the following decades, other explorers investigated. In 1858, the German geographer Heinrich Barth made careful sketches, and a few years later, in 1861, the Frenchman Georges Perrault conducted small excavations of his own, uncovering relief sculptures at Yazilikaya. It was Perrault who first boldly suggested in 1886 that these might be the remains of the lost Hittite capital of Hattusa, based on the size and style of the artifacts, which seemed to match the scant hints about Hittites from outside sources. But still, definitive proof was lacking. The breakthrough came only with systematic excavations. In 1905, the first formal digging was carried out by Hugo Winkler, a German archaeologist, and Theodore Macready, a Turkish Ottoman archaeologist on behalf of the German Orient Society. They returned in 1906 and focused on the high mound of Buyukale. What they found soon changed our understanding of ancient history. The remains of a palace storeroom. They unearthed hundreds of clay tablet fragments. By the end of that season, Winkler had recovered over 2,500 clay tablets or pieces thereof. Many were written in a then unknown language, but a few were in Akkadian and contained tantalizing names and titles, crucially references to a country called Hatti and a king named Muatali. These corresponded perfectly to names in Egyptian records. Ramesses II's foe at Kadesh was a King Muatali of Hatti, confirming that Bogoskoy was indeed the royal capital of the Hittite Empire. The lost city of Hattusa had been found, and its own records were speaking at last. As more tablets were unearthed and scholars began deciphering them, the entire chronology and culture of the Hittites emerged from oblivion. The tablets from Hattusa's archive proved to be the key to unlocking the long-lost Hittite language and history. In 1915, a Czech linguist named Bedřich Hrozný famously deciphered the Hittite language by recognizing it as Indo-European. He examined a tablet and read the words Nu Ninda An Ezateni Watar Ma Ukuteni, which, pardon my poor Hittite, translated as, now you will eat bread and drink water, noting that Ninda, bread, resembled Latin panis, and watar, water, was akin to the English water. This breakthrough in understanding showed that a seemingly alien Hittite spoke a language related to Latin and Sanskrit, making Hittite the oldest attested Indo-European language. The confirmation that Hittite was part of the Indo-European family revolutionized linguistics and validated comparative language theories. It was now clear that the inscriptions from Hattusa constituted a vast treasury of historical texts, royal decrees, myths, prayers, treaties, and more, all from a people who had been reduced to a biblical footnote. The rediscovery of Hattusa vindicated ancient references that had puzzled scholars for years. All of a sudden, these Hittites, mentioned passingly in the Hebrew Bible and a few Egyptian chronicles, stood revealed as the powerful kings of a Bronze Age empire. Well, in a sense, the Hittites had never completely vanished from the human record. Those obscure biblical Hittites, such as the warrior Uriah or the merchants of Canaan, and the references in Egyptian and Assyrian inscriptions were echoes of this once great people. But the problem was, without Hattusa, those echoes were heard but misunderstood. But now the true picture came into focus. The Hittites were not a minor tribe at all, but they were the lords of an advanced civilization, and Hattusa was indeed their throne city. So throughout the 20th and into the 21st century, excavations at Hattusa have continued under the direction of the German Archaeological Institute in cooperation with Turkish authorities. Generations of archaeologists, such as Kurt Bittel, who led post-war digs from the 30s to the 70s, Peter Neve, 1970s to 90s, and Jürgen Seer, 1990s to 2000s, expanded the excavation trenches to cover Hattusa's temples, fortifications, and residential areas. Today, under the director Andreas Schnatter, that is Schachner? Andreas Schachner, archaeological work still proceeds, focusing on uncovering remaining domestic quarters and conserving the exposed structures. These efforts have revealed new facets of Hattusa. For example, in 1986, a remarkable discovery was made west of the Sphinx Gate. A large bronze tablet inscribed with a treaty between Tudalia IV and his cousin Kuranta of Tarhuntasa, shedding light on the Hittite political arrangements in the late empire. In 1991, a bronze sword of Mycenaean Greek make was found at the site, bearing an Akkadian inscription that read, "As Tudalia the great king destroyed the land of Asua, the western lands that is, he dedicated these swords to the storm god." This artifact dramatically illustrated the Hittites' far-reaching campaigns and the cosmopolitan nature of their spoils. Another excavation season uncovered a cache of 3,400 clay ceilings in a burned building, apparently the remnants of a Hittite record office. Now, each one sealed a document or container, many pertaining to land grants and administration, providing insight into how Hattusa managed its estates. In any case, each little find, it just enriches our understanding of what was going on. But perhaps most importantly, Hattusa's excavation has given us access to the voices of the Hittites themselves. allowing us to reconstruct a long-lost chapter of the late Bronze Age in a rather intimate detail. We now have correspondence between Hittite kings and their contemporaries, legal disputes and verdicts, inventory lists of palace warehouses, and even school texts where apprentice scribes copied proverbs. For example, one clay tablet is a royal letter in which a Hittite queen complains to the Pharaoh of Egypt about delays in sending her fine linen garments, an amusing glimpse of international communication. Another tablet contains the provisions of a treaty and ends with the list of divine witnesses and curses. The Hittites, long just a name in ancient scriptures, have come alive through these kind of records. And so, today, Hattusa is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized for its outstanding universal value as a well-preserved Bronze Age capital. Visitors can walk along a stretch of reconstructed city walls, pass through the weathered Lion Gate as people did 3,300 years ago, and stand atop the citadel, where kings brokered alliances and plotted wars. The nearby Bogoskoye Museum displays many artifacts from the site, including cuneiform tablets, seals, and ceramics. Notably, the pair of Sphinx statues from the Sphinx Gate, one of which had been taken to Germany in 1917, as we mentioned, now reunited, flanking the museum's entrance. History comes full circle, In Ankara''s Museum of Anatolian Civilizations, you can see the bronze tablet of Tudalia Kurunta Treaty, and in Istanbul's Archaeological Museum, a clay tablet copy of the Treaty of Kadesh is proudly exhibited. These tangible pieces allow us to connect directly with the world of Hattusa's people. And, well, for historians and the public alike, the rediscovery of Hattusa had been quite revelatory. It revealed a critical blank in the map of the ancient Near East. Suddenly, around 1906, we gained evidence of that lost empire. Hattusa has provided many firsts to modern scholarship. The earliest known Indo-European written language, one of the earliest comprehensive law codes, the first recorded international peace treaty, and extensive archives that have illuminated Bronze Age politics, religion, and society. All in all, what a place. Well, perhaps one day we can all get ourselves over to Hattusa and really soak it all in. I hope so. I have not been to Turkey yet, but I will get there eventually. Now, I would like to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters of the channel: Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Cuckoo Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Nephthys, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Venita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, David, Jennifer, Brittany, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Katie P, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Brinny, Aiden, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, Alexa, Big Gun, 101, Brandy, Bestie Hun, Stevie, Jessica, Scott, Gail, Emily, Jade, Jake, Demon's Toe, Mason, John, Magenta, Dumpster, Tracy, Mossy Frog, Catherine, Ezio's Art, Autumn, Monica, Jennifer, White Rags, Gertrude, Rose, Formal Horse, Sandpiper, Mike, Darth Mel, Daryl, Michelle, Ezio, Melissa, Joy, Jennifer, Lindsay, Leah, Jax, Chayla, DRD, Nyan Binary, Skull Kid, Max, Virginiast, Tater, Tessa, Kyrene, Debbie, Chadwick, Catherine, Lily, Foodie, Scariness, Haldor, Lastera, Heather, and Lindsay. Thank you all so much. We couldn't keep this ad free without your help, so it is appreciated. Now, with all that being said and done, I think that's enough for today. Thank you very much for joining me back to the Bronze Age. We'll have more Bronze Age coming up soon. It's just a topic of endless fascination. In any case, good night and farewell for now.